Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Now, we've covered an awful lot of maritime history on this channel. We've been running it for about 5 years now. Now, who among us doesn't like to sit down and watch 3 or 4 hours of maritime history back to back? Maybe you need help sleeping. Maybe you just want to have something on in the background for a long drive. Maybe you just love ships a lot, like me. So please sit back and relax while we turn back the pages of time and look at the history of great ships. It's September 21st, 1911, and the world's largest, newest, and grandest passenger steamer, White Star Line's RMS Olympic, is slowly limping her way back to Southampton, a massive triangle-shaped gash in her side. Onlookers are aghast at the state of the liner, and the word is beginning to spread about the accident that has caused her injuries. The Olympic, having recently departed on her 5th voyage for New York, was making her way out of the narrow channel of the Solent to the open waters of the Atlantic under the guidance of a harbour pilot, as was routine. Shortly after, as she was leaving, she was joined by a smaller vessel, the protected cruiser HMS Hawke of the Royal Navy, which had been undergoing her annual power trials. As the two ships went about navigating the channel, the Hawke following closely behind Olympic, things took a sudden, jarring turn. The cruiser began to close in on the liner to a distance of about 100 feet until her stem was in line with Olympic's bridge. As the liner gained speed, she began to pull away from the cruiser that seemed hell-bent on overtaking her, but then the unexplainable happened. Witnesses said they watched as, seemingly out of nowhere, the cruiser made a sudden turn to port, possibly in an attempt to cross Olympic's wake and pass behind her. But instead, the cruiser just swung out at a nearly perfectly right angle, plunging her bow directly into the liner's side, the force of the impact being felt by passengers throughout the ship. When the Hawke finally managed to break free of the liner's hull, it left behind a gaping wound near Olympic's engine room, and clear damage to her machinery. Once it pulled away, the Hawke's once prominent bow was found to have been crushed flat by the impact. But by some miracle, both ships stayed afloat, and there were no casualties on either side. But even in that moment, passengers who had witnessed the accident couldn't manage to make sense of what had just happened. Now with Olympic tied up back at Southampton, requiring extensive repairs, the world was left to wonder about what exactly had happened in those fateful moments of the Solent. Was it the work of a disgruntled officer gone rogue, some kind of equipment malfunction, or the result of some other mysterious force of nature? The Olympic Hawke collision is one of the most well-known ship incidents in history that isn't a disaster. It's not well known for the loss of life or the amount of injuries. There were none. But for the sheer drama of it all, because it delayed the finishing of Titanic, and because the grandest ship in the world, the Olympic, was badly damaged in her initial season. And because the damage seemed to prove that ships like Olympic were, at last, unsinkable. Weirdly though, few video productions have given much thought to the collision at all, or shown it in any great detail. So today, let's change that. We'll wind the clock back and witness the impact for ourselves. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this is the story of the collision between HMS Hawke and RMS Olympic. The Solent, a strait running around 20 miles in length and up to 5 miles wide. On one side of this channel, you'll find the Isle of Wight, and on the other, mainland England. This channel is a vital one for maritime traffic, as all vessels approaching or leaving Southampton have to navigate its waters. Coming down through the east side of the Solent, a ship must navigate through a series of navigational buoys before reaching a stretch of water known as Spithead, and finally making it to the open waters of the English Channel, and eventually the Atlantic. This was, of course, no easy task. The channel is relatively narrow, the turns are frequent and very precise. There's very little room for error when navigating through and around other shipping traffic. A task requiring this level of precision is best left to an expert, a harbour pilot, whose task is to navigate a ship through narrow, shallow waterways like this on its way to or from the harbour. Harbour pilots are tasked with knowing these waters like the back of their own hand, and seeing to it that the ship is guided safely to its destination. Think of them like a temporary and highly specialised captain brought on board only for the trickiest parts of that voyage. On September 20th, 1911, RMS Olympic was making her way out of Southampton water towards the open Atlantic via the Solent, with 1,313 passengers aboard on her 5th voyage en route to Cherbourg, France, and eventually New York. Pilot George William Bowyer was guiding the ship through the channel. This was his 5th time as acting master of this new and notable vessel. All was perfectly routine. Shortly after noon, the ship was making her way south out of Southampton water, having left the dock. Having sighted the Hawke steaming on her eastward course, Olympic sounded 2 blasts of her horn to let the Hawke know of her intention to round the West Bramble buoy. She was making around 12 knots. At the same time, HMS Hawke, a protected cruiser of the Royal Navy, was also navigating the Solent under the guidance of Commander William Blunt. She wasn't making for the Atlantic. Instead, she was headed back east through the Channel after having completed the first half of her annual power trials. Shortly after 12:30 p.m, Lieutenant Geoffrey Bashford, officer of the watch, had just finished his lunch and arrived back on the bridge of the Hawke in time to spot the large and opulent White Star liner making her way south and preparing to navigate the complex series of buoys in the area. A few minutes later, the crew of Hawke noted the 2 puffs of steam from Olympic's whistles as she stated her intention to port around the West Bramble buoy and into the East Solent. Now, realizing a ship of Olympic's size would need as much breathing room for that turn as possible, Commander Blunt ordered the Hawke on a slightly more northerly course to make way for the other ship. So far, nothing was out of the ordinary. This kind of thing played out day after day in the Solent, and it still does to this day. Once she made her way around the West Bramble buoy, Olympic headed into a straightaway that allowed her to pick up speed. She steadied onto her new course, and her 3 engines were run up to full ahead, with intention to increase her speed to around 20 knots. Still reduced steam, but basically maximum speed for those restricted waterways. The Hawke was making around 15 knots, no slouch, still faster than Olympic at that moment, as it took time for the larger ship to work up to her full speed. Olympic's manoeuvre around the buoy and into the straightaway had put her on a near parallel course with the Hawke, steaming along on her starboard side, but the 2 ships had now become suddenly frighteningly close. Passengers looked on as the 2 vessels steamed side by side, Hawke's stem falling just behind Olympic's bridge, with a distance of about 400 or 500 yards between the 2 of them. The pair maintained this course for about 5 minutes, but then something went horribly, disastrously wrong. The cruiser began to fall back behind Olympic until her bow was just behind Olympic's 3rd funnel, and witnesses say she looked to be making a sudden turn to port, directly into the path of the liner. Seemingly, this may have been to cross behind the larger ship, but it quickly became clear that if that was her intention, she wasn't going to be able to pull it off. Up on the bridge of Olympic, both Captain Smith and Captain Bowyer, the pilot, realized the cruiser steaming alongside them was simply too close for comfort. While the 2 had initially hoped the Hawke was making an attempt to cross behind them, that hope began to fade fast. As the cruiser drew closer in, Smith remarked to his pilot, "I do not believe she will go under our stern, Bowyer." He replied, "If she's going to strike us, let me know in time to put our helm hard a port." Smith paused, taking stock of the situation, but time was of the essence. Bowyer pressed, "Is she going to strike us or not, sir?" "Yes, Bowyer," Smith responded, "she's going to strike us in the stern." Bowyer quickly ordered the helm hard over to port, but it was too late. Onlookers could do little more than watch in horror as Hawke's bow swung in towards their ship at an almost perfectly right angle, and then came the impact. Hawke's bow, which had been designed with a ram below the waterline, drove itself 8 feet deep into Olympic's side like a knife, the sounds of metal crumpling being heard throughout much of the ship. The forward momentum of the liner then pulled the bow of the cruiser from her side just a few moments later, leaving behind a massive triangular wound and allowing in a sudden onrush of water into the ship's critical machine spaces. The watertight doors were ordered shut from the bridge, and both vessels ordered their engines stopped. Once freed from the Olympic's hull, Hawke had rolled heavily to one side and spun, but righted herself quickly. Her own bow had been crushed nearly flat by the impact. Both ships, though, stayed afloat. Save for the initial shock among the passengers, there was very little commotion aboard Olympic after the collision. No injuries or casualties were reported, and some passengers barely even noticed anything had happened at all. Once the initial alarm had worn off, what remained was an air of confusion. Nobody quite knew what to make of what they'd just witnessed. It seemed as though the cruiser had rammed the ship on purpose, but why would they do such a thing? John J. Sinclair, who'd been travelling on Olympic on his way home to New York, gave a statement to the New York Times when he said, "I saw the affair and it seemed to me that the man in charge of the cruiser must have gone crazy. The sentiment was echoed by several other witnesses, all of whom claimed that they watched as the HMS Hawke appeared to violently ram the passenger liner without warning or reason. Another passenger commented, "Something must have been wrong with the steering gear of the cruiser, or else the fellow in charge was crazy." Crazy became the word of the day, a testament to just how preposterous the collision truly seemed to those watching from the decks of Olympic in full sunshine and perfectly clear weather. With more questions than answers, most passengers seemed to turn their attention to the delays they would have to inevitably face as a result of the accident, because obviously Olympic wasn't going anywhere. Meanwhile, the crew went about learning the extent of Olympic's injuries. Aboard the Hawke, unfortunately, the situation was just as bewildering. At the wheel was Quartermaster Ernest Hunt, who'd just taken the helm from Officer Henry Yates. Yates had been ordered by Commander Blunt to steady on the Edgar being another cruiser which was anchored up ahead in Stokes Bay. By steering the Hawke in line with the Edgar, it was hoped the ship's course would stay true without veering any closer to Olympic, which was now closing in fast. The ship's crew watched as the massive liner steadied on her course, and Commander Blunt, unhappy with Yates' ability to actually steady the ship, ordered Hunt to take the helm, and the cruiser was put in line with the other one anchored ahead of them. "Port 5, steady on the right-hand fort," Blunt ordered a few moments later, referring to no man's fort on their right-hand side. But this is where things began to go very wrong. The Hawke began a slow swing toward the liner on her port side, at which point Blunt shouted, "What are you doing with your helm? Port, port, hard to port." The helm was jammed at 15 degrees to port, and it wouldn't budge. The cruiser was now effectively out of control, and there was nothing stopping her from driving her bow directly into the side of the steel behemoth steaming beside her. Blunt tried helplessly to stop both engines and then run them full speed astern, but much like Bowyer's own orders being sung out at the exact same moment on Olympic, it was too little, too late. Seconds later, there came the impact. Once the two ships pulled themselves apart, the first order of business for Olympic was to make her way back to port and assess the damage. She was anchored overnight in Osborne Bay, and it was clear, even to those without shipbuilding experience, that she would not be seeing New York anytime soon. By 8 a.m. the next morning, with 6 tugs assisting her, she slowly made her way back to Southampton, under her own power, but hobbled, her stern noticeably down in the water. Harland & Wolff, the shipyard responsible for her construction, actually had facilities available in Southampton for smaller or more routine repairs, but it was obvious that this was going to be a job for the dry dock back in Belfast. Olympic was the world's largest ship, and accommodating her massive size would prove to be an impossibility anywhere else but Belfast, at the very yard that had built her. In the meantime, a partial survey was conducted at Southampton to give the ship's owners a clearer picture of the damage. What they found was discouraging, to say the least. Hawke had left a triangular hole about 12 feet in length just aft of Olympic's well deck, extending below the waterline all the way up to D-deck, a distance of about 14 feet. The shell plating had been torn to shreds at the side of the impact, and surrounding beams and frames had taken a beating as well. Hawke's bow had smashed straight through 4 and 6 berth third-class cabins on E and part of D-deck, absolutely obliterating them. Thankfully, because the ship was just departing, the cabins were empty, with their occupants presumably out on deck taking in the exciting sights. Otherwise, it's not unthinkable that one or more entire families could have been wiped out by that sudden, terrifying blow. The damage also extended to her machine spaces below, where it was found that a section of her starboard propeller shaft bossing had been bent, and her starboard propeller blades had also been broken up. She would need to be sent off to Harland & Wolff shipyard in Belfast to see major repairs completed. At first, it was feared that while these repairs were underway, Olympic would need to be pulled from service for up to 3 months. To get Olympic back in action, she'd need to get back to Belfast, but for that, she'd need to be patched up. The Southampton Harland & Wolff works fixed up a temporary wooden patch, complete with a drainage pipe. It was just a short voyage to Belfast, but the patch would make sure Olympic's compartments wouldn't flood along the way. She limped her way back to Belfast, where work was continuing on Titanic, which at that time could only boast one standing funnel. Harland & Wolff got to work pulling men from Titanic to turn Olympic around as quickly as possible to improve on that 3-month outlook. Thankfully, she was made seaworthy again in just 2 months' time, but the work had been done at the expense of Titanic's completion, and this meant that her proposed maiden voyage would be pushed back by almost a full month from March 20th to April 10th, the next year. The changes to White Star's schedule were less than ideal for other reasons as well. The passengers who'd boarded Olympic the day of her collision now scrambled to find passage elsewhere. White Star's offices were flooded with anxious travellers in the hours following her return to Southampton. There would scarcely be enough available berths to accommodate all of them, even on all the other ships available. Now, this spike in demand for passage caused a run on steamers bound for New York, and obtaining a berth on any of the remaining in-service liners came at a premium, with Olympic withdrawn from service. Many travellers looking to transfer onto a new ship were told there was simply nothing available. They'd need to wait up to a fortnight in Europe until they would be able to book passage on another ship. Mr. Harry Payne Whitney was one of these passengers who was simply out of luck. He was quoted as saying, "I suppose I shall now have to become a permanent Britisher." But with the drama over, the question remained of who was at fault for the accident and what exactly had caused it to begin with. On the day following the incident, September 21st, 1911, an inquiry was launched by Admiral Moore, Commander-in-Chief at Portsmouth. This inquiry was to take place on board the wounded Hawke, and despite directions for the inquiry to be strict and careful, that's a quote, what followed could only be described as very one-sided. No representatives from the crew of the Olympic, nor the White Star Line were present, and Commander Blunt of the Hawke ended up giving 1/3 of the total statements collected during the inquiry. It came as little surprise then, when the results of the inquiry showed conclusively that Olympic was solely to blame. White Star was understandably less than thrilled with this outcome, and what resulted was 3 years of trials, inquiries, and appeals, all in an attempt to unravel the story of what had caused this bizarre collision. On Thursday, November 16th, 1911, hearings began into the cause of the collision between the two ships. Overseen by Sir Samuel Evans, this hearing was to be far more fair and comprehensive than the inquiry that had come just after the incident. Both sides were allowed to state their arguments before the court. White Star asserted that the collision was solely the fault of the Hawke, who had neglected to keep out of their way, and that their helm was improperly starboarded, or her head was improperly allowed to come to port, and that she had improperly, and at an inappropriate time, attempted to pass to the southward that is behind of Olympic. The government, representing the crew of the Royal Navy cruiser, retorted that among other things, Olympic had come too close to the Hawke, at too great a speed, and had taken too wide a sweep round the West Bramble buoy, and had not starboarded sufficiently or in due time. Like most court cases, it descended into a game of pointing fingers, with the question of overtaking versus converging vessels being hot on everybody's lips. According to maritime rules, every vessel overtaking any other shall keep out of way of the overtaken vessel. Now, White Star argued that Olympic was being overtaken by Hawke, and therefore Hawke had been in violation of the rule. But on the contrary, the government argued that the two ships were on converging courses. This would make them crossing vessels, pointing to the rule of maritime law that stated that the vessel which has the other on her starboard side shall keep out of the way of the other. With Hawke on Olympic's starboard side, this would mean it was Olympic who had failed to give way to the cruiser. It basically came down to this. Hawke's men and the Admiralty said the collision had occurred immediately in the wake of Olympic's turn around the West Bramble buoy, meaning the ship should have given way to the vessel on her right, the Hawke, as per the rules of the road. White Star Line argued that the collision had occurred far enough after the turn that instead the overtaking laws should have been at play, and that Hawke was at fault for not keeping clear of the vessel she was trying to overtake. Exactly where the collision had even occurred, which might actually clear up that matter, couldn't be determined. Now, with multiple conflicting reports of everything from positioning to the timeline painting a clearer picture of the incident, it all came down to the finest of details. In the end, the judgment handed down in the inquiry would be another blow for the White Star Line. On December 19th, 1911, Samuel Evans handed his decision. He established, in this scenario, the two ships were on converging courses, and Olympic had failed to give way to the Hawke, which was a crossing vessel, not an overtaking one. But the blame didn't land squarely on the shoulders of the White Star Line, because Evans had granted that since she was under the command of a pilot at the time of the collision, the true blame lay with the negligence of pilot Bowyer, and not the ship's owners or crew. This was really unfortunate. George Bowyer was a Southampton legend who had a fantastic safety record and was extremely popular with the captains he set out to meet and guide into safety. This capable chap would have to wear the blame. But this still didn't sit well with the White Star Line's top brass. They'd been hoping to clear their name entirely and heal the reputational damage inflicted by the collision. So to the Court of Appeals they went, hoping to overturn the verdict and prove once and for all that Olympic had been totally blameless on the incident. Appeal hearings started in March 13th, 1912. It was White Star's hope that this time around, by arguing that the site of the collision differed considerably from what was claimed by the crew of the Hawke, they could convince the court of their version of events. This time they came armed with evidence. Just 1 month prior, a 7.5-ton piece of wreckage had been pulled from the bottom of the channel near the location of the collision. A huge chunk of Hawke's forefoot ripped from the ship as she plunged her way into Olympic's side. By pinpointing the position of this find, the White Star Line hoped to convince the court that the collision had happened more northward and closer to the centre of the channel than what had been asserted by the crew of the Hawke. This would have proved that the collision had happened long after Olympic had completed her turn and that the Hawke was indeed an overtaking vessel. But it was to no avail. At the conclusion of the hearings, despite the effort put forth on White Star's part to bring new evidence to light, it was found that this evidence still had not proven that the Hawke had been an overtaking ship, rather than a crossing one. And since this was the real issue at hand from the court's point of view, the original judgment held. Lord Justice Parker, who was overseeing the hearings, maintained that the blame still lay with the pilot, George Bowyer, who according to Parker had, quote, misjudged the situation, the relative speeds of the two vessels or their distance from each other, and his own position in the channel, and thus failed to realise his duty to keep out of the way. But the White Star Line was still not content with this outcome. Hoping for one final shot at clearing their name, White Star Line took the case to the House of Lords, the highest court in Britain. Now, by this point, 3 years had passed since the collision, and it was the company's hope that any evidence or new findings that had come forth since then would be enough to finally sway the court's decision in their favour, but still it was not to be. The court once again ruled in the Hawke's favour, upholding the original judgment, dismissing the appeal for the final time. For pilot George Bowyer, it was a professional blow. You can tell he was frustrated by the whole thing, because he later wrote, "Through the Olympic Hawke case, the late Captain E.J. Smith, the officers and I told the truth and nothing but the truth. It was taken to the House of Lords, but the verdict was not altered, the Olympic losing the case. However, the company thought we were right, and I've piloted the Olympic, the Homeric, and the Majestic hundreds of times, up to my retirement on December 31st, 1929. White Star and the city of Southampton never turned their back on Bowyer, and as his memoirs noted, he stayed in the Trinity House pilotage service all through the 20s. But there may have actually been more at play that afternoon than simply a harbour pilot misjudging the course and speed of another ship, and it wouldn't be long until it was impossible to ignore other evidence. In the middle of these court cases, a new idea was beginning to gain traction. It was first proposed by the British Admiralty. The theory that perhaps suction had played a role in the collision. It was thought by some that the two ships travelling relatively closely to one another in a narrow, shallow waterway may result in the smaller ship being pulled in towards the larger ship by sheer force of the amount of water being displaced by the latter. But it wasn't an idea that either side felt confident enough to seriously entertain, at least not at this point in history. Representing the White Star Line in the original inquiry, Mr. F. Lang attempted to downplay the idea, stating that, "I call attention with some confidence in this case to the evidence, not of scientific experts, but of navigational experts, and the evidence I rely upon is Captain Smith." It seemed, at this point in time, it was an easier task to argue negligence in the court of law than to rely on what some might have considered crack science. But officials and the public began to take greater notice of this newfangled phenomenon when it made headlines a year after Olympic's collision with Hawke. On April 10th, 1912, Titanic was finally departing from Southampton after a month-long delay caused by Olympic's patching up. As the brand new Ocean Leviathan got underway with the assistance of tugs, her engines were slowly worked up to around 8 or 9 knots. As she proceeded carefully through the shallow, restricted waters near her dock, 2 other steamers were moored nearby, White Star's RMS Oceanic and the SS New York of the American line. As Titanic made her way through the narrow waterway and approached the 2 vessels, something very strange began to happen. Onlookers watched as the 2 smaller vessels were at first pushed up against the dock, but then their sterns turned to swing outward towards Titanic. The smaller New York seemed to fight against her mooring lines, and then to everyone's horror, the lines snapped, sending the ship on a collision course towards the bigger ship. Titanic's second-class passenger, Lawrence Beasley, recalled, "To our amazement, the New York crept towards us, slowly and stealthily, as if drawn in by some invisible force which she was powerless to withstand. The tugs, Neptune and Vulcan, made all haste to bring the smaller ship to heel. As Titanic reversed her engines to hopefully bring the situation under control, the New York came within 4 feet of Titanic before being successfully reined in by the tugs, which pulled the ship back, quote, like a naughty child." With the threat past, relief swept over passengers and crew and onlookers, all of whom were very grateful that Titanic had been spared in this brush with disaster. But of course, much greater danger was still laying in wait ahead, and perhaps history would look much different had Titanic actually suffered a delay thanks to the collision with the smaller vessel. Now, this phenomenon, experienced by both the New York, as she was pulled in towards Titanic, and the Hawke, as she swerved into the Olympic side, would later become known as negative hydrodynamic interaction, also simply called a suction theory. Now, this idea asserts that as two ships are passing in close proximity in shallow water, the force in the water created as one ship moves through it is enough to cause an unintended pushing or pulling of the nearby vessel, thanks to the effects of that water's displacement around the vessel, usually the bigger one, causing the suction. As one ship passes close by another, water is constantly being pushed aside as it cuts through, and other vessels and objects close by can get swept up in the forceful movement of the water and may end up sucked in back towards the ship as it passes. Now, this was especially noticeable when one ship is considerably larger than the other, as was the case with both Olympic and her run-in with the Hawke, and Titanic's near-miss with New York the following year. This theory was tested during the 1911 hearings into the Olympic Hawke collision by David Watson Taylor of the US Navy, who used the Washington Model Basin to recreate the circumstances of the collision on a smaller scale using wax models of the two ships. Each time he ran the experiment, even with the Hawke's helm hard over, the cruiser was inevitably pulled in towards the larger ship by suction. His experiments revealed that had Hawke been truly attempting to overtake Olympic, she would not have been able to actually succeed. It was almost inevitable that Hawke would have found herself sucked in towards the larger ship, thanks to the proximity and the forces of water displacement at work. Taylor brought his findings to court, revealing the results of his experiments in the testimony during the hearings. Now, the Admiralty and the court were both open to exploring the theory, but the White Star Line was quick to shut it down as having little bearing on the case. The reasoning for this is fairly obvious. The White Star Line couldn't bring themselves to admit that the sheer scale, the sheer size of the ships that they were building was having an impact on their safety, so it was swept cleanly under the rug. Opinions elsewhere were mixed as well, with an article published in Nautical magazine mocking the experiments as children playing with toys in a bathtub, in pleasant remembrance of younger days, they said. Now, at the time of the hearings, the theory wasn't yet well understood enough to be taken seriously in a court of law. But as the years have passed and more studies have been done, it's now widely accepted that this was in fact the mysterious force of nature that caused Hawke's bow to suddenly swing in and collide with Olympic, despite the best efforts of the ship's crew to fight against it. The White Star Line would go on to be forced to cover the costs of Olympic's repairs and the court costs, both, an unfortunate outcome, but one that the company was prepared to handle. The decision was also overshadowed in public opinion by the lingering after effects of the loss of Titanic just a year later. The company seemed destined to not find sure footing again after the numerous court battles and the eventual decimation of the Olympic class with the sinking of both Titanic and Britannic, which left Olympic the last surviving superliner ever laid down for the now famous shipping company. As for the Hawke, once her repairs were completed, including a total replacement of her prominent ram with a straight stem, she was back in service by late 1911. During the First World War, while on blockade duties in the North Sea, along with 7 other cruisers that comprised the 10th Cruiser Squadron of the Royal Navy, she would meet her end. In October 1914, the Hawke was on a routine stop to pick up mail when suddenly all communication went dark. The destroyer Swift was sent to assess the situation and came back with 22 survivors on board, plus another 49 that had been rescued by a nearby Norwegian steamer. A single torpedo from the German U-boat U-9 had dealt the Hawke a fatal blow. She was lost in just 8 minutes. 524 souls, tragically, went with her. The whereabouts of the Hawke remained a mystery until just last year, in August 2024, when the surprisingly intact wreck was discovered off the Aberdeenshire coast of Scotland after resting at the bottom of the sea for over 110 years. It's impossible to pick up a book about the Titanic without reading about the Olympic Hawke collision. It's just so interwoven with that story. And you can't help but wonder if Olympic hadn't delayed Titanic's construction because of that collision, if Titanic in turn would ever have encountered the iceberg that sent her to the bottom of the ocean. It's one of history's greatest what-if mysteries. One thing is for certain, the Olympic and the Hawke collision is full of plenty of drama. In fact, the photographs that survive to this day are some of the most dramatic ship collision pictures that have survived history. It earns the story a very well-deserved spot in the pantheon of maritime incidents. Most famous shipping disasters have happened out of sight, under cover of darkness like that of Titanic, or in a raging storm. The simple truth is that for hundreds of years, humans have taken to the ocean in ships, but the camera is a relatively recent development. Before the camera, it was up to painters and artists to recreate how disasters at sea might have looked. But nowadays, people can play witness to real events without having to actually be there, and the result is chilling. From the results of dramatic collisions, the aftermath of deadly storms, or the dramatic rescue of people from burning ships. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and these are my picks for some of the most dramatic shipping disasters ever caught on camera. The SS Iowan was a small steamer built in 1912, some 6,500 registered tons and just over 407 feet or 124 meters in length. No giant by any means, but a steady, reliable ship in a class of 8, each named for a US state. They would link the US mainland and Hawaii, regularly ferrying out refrigerated cargo from the west coast. Her early career was fairly straightforward, using her 490,000 cubic feet of storage space to ship exotic goods like pineapples and sugars back from Hawaii. But then, the most dramatic thing happened in October 1914. This time, the ship was steaming out of New York, since the Panama Canal had opened, allowing trade with the eastern seaboard as well. Iowan was steaming at a decent clip through the entrance of the Ambrose Channel, the dense sea lane that leads into New York and New Jersey. Now this is a tightly packed, busy bit of water, only 5.8 miles or 9.5 kilometers across at the entrance. Now that might sound big to us landlubbers, but to a ship's crew, it's almost as narrow as it gets, with little margin for error. You can only imagine how tough it would be to navigate if you couldn't see ahead. Well, that October day, as Iowan steamed through the channel for open ocean at speed, a dense cloud of fog had rolled in and totally obscured visibility. Now, in situations like this, it was considered the best thing for ships to slow right down, but to continue moving ahead to maintain something called steerage way, which is just enough water rushing over the rudder to ensure that the ship could actually turn. Now, at a dead stop, a ship is effectively uncontrollable, and it could easily drift into a lee shore, that is, nearby coastline, in the direction that the wind is blowing. Now, Iowan's skipper, Captain R. Pearson, didn't seem to slow down a bit. Instead, he set about customarily blasting his whistles at intervals to warn of his approach. But then, out of the fog ahead, there loomed another ship. It was the small passenger steamer SS Metapan. Metapan was a combination cargo passenger liner run by the United Fruit Company, about 3,000 tons smaller than Iowan. The ship was entering the channel for New York loaded with fruit and South and Central American passengers, but unlike Iowan, she was actually stopped dead in her tracks, waiting for the fog to pass. With 300 yards or 250 meters between them, a collision should have been totally avoidable. Metapan blasted her whistles, but Iowan kept on coming, seeming to ignore the danger. With no attempt made to change course, Iowan simply dropped her anchors in an attempt to slow down, and with a deep crunch and a lurch, the two ships collided. Iowan sank her bow about halfway through the Metapan's forward hull, and with the force of the collision, the two ships were separated and lost again in the fog. Metapan's skipper now had to act quickly. With tons and tons of water now roaring in, he rushed his ship for the shallow channel bank to beach it and prevent it from totally sinking, got his lifeboats ready and lowered his passengers away. With a sickening lurch, Metapan struck the bottom of the channel and stuck fast while her stern was comically lifted clear of the water. Now the result was a pathetic sight, with Metapan half sunken and resting on the bottom with a huge gouge taken out of her bow. Fortunately, the evacuation was perfectly executed and without casualties, but this remarkable bit of footage was taken from rescue and survey vessels showing the extent of the damage and the poor old Metapan frozen in place on the channel bank. Now, this is a fairly obscure event, so I haven't been able to track down the results of the accident, but passengers and crew blamed Iowan for not slowing down or changing course when the ships had spotted one another. Iowan's bow was crushed, but she was returned to service and went on to become a troop transport and cargo vessel which served successfully in both world wars, but the Metapan was patched and refloated and eventually sunk by a mine without casualties in the Second World War. But this time her sinking was for good. Sadly though, not all maritime incidents are as relatively harmless as that of the Iowan and the Metapan. Captured on film in 1954 is the overturned hull of a Japanese ferry, the ship called Toya Maru, and this is one of the worst peacetime maritime disasters of all time. Toya Maru was built in 1947, part of an effort to rebuild Japan's merchant fleet. Japan's navy had been simply shattered by the Second World War. In fact, of all the nation's dozens and dozens of big passenger ships from before the war, only 2 had survived, including the Hikawa Maru, which is today moored in Yokohama as a museum ship. Toya Maru was no giant, but she was new and she was modern, almost 4,000 registered tons and 390 feet, or 119 meters long. Now, the ship was a ferry designed to link a railhead between Japan's 2 main islands, from Aomori and Hakodate. It was a 4.5-hour trip, 55 kilometers, or 33 miles of which would be through the Tsugaru Strait. Now, Toya Maru was a new style of ferry, the roll-on, roll-off ferry, which we've covered on this channel before. Suffice it to say, this style of ship had a bit of a troubled beginning because they relied on cars being able to drive straight into the hull, resulting in poor watertight subdivisioning, allowing easy access, and huge doors that were a natural Achilles heel in the design. Now, the Tsugaru Strait is a particularly rough bit of water, essentially an open sea, given the nickname of the woman who calls the storm. And in 1954, 7 years into Toya Maru's career, the strait would live up to that moniker with deadly accuracy. Japan's typhoons are wild, raging storms that roar in, causing devastation. But they are not short-lived events. Rather, they tend to hang and mope around, sometimes blowing over the mainland, and other times swinging wildly out to sea. Typhoon Marie had smashed through the main island of Honshu in September 1954, and then lay offshore in the Sea of Japan. Toya Maru was maintaining her usual busy schedule, an important one given the need to link the 2 main Japanese islands, but on September 26th, her departure from Hakodate was delayed as her captain observed and predicted the path of the typhoon. It was predicted to hit the Tsugaru Strait and blow clean through sometime around 5 PM. Now, another ferry's trip was cancelled entirely, so that ship's cars and passengers were instead loaded aboard Toya Maru as well, and the ship sat waiting for a chance to cross all day. Hours later, at 5 PM, the weather had begun to clear as predicted, and Toya Maru's captain assumed the typhoon had passed safely through the area. The ferry completed loading, made steam and set off for Aomori. But tragically, Toya Maru's captain was misinformed. Typhoon Marie had somehow picked up strength and power in its time through the Sea of Japan, which was unusual. It was now an extratropical cyclone with winds howling through at incredible speeds. It hadn't cleared the strait at all, and instead it was going to remain in place an entire day. Toya Maru was going to steam right into the heart of it. Sure enough, conditions got gradually worse. With the wind picking up, the ferry's captain must have realised his mistake. Less than half an hour after leaving, he decided to wait for the typhoon to calm and anchor his ship near Hakodate port where they had just left, which was a simple enough manoeuvre in calm weather, but a tall order in a storm. The anchor didn't hold, and the ferry slipped away, drifting at the storm's mercy. Those big doors designed to allow cars conveniently into the ship now began to take on tons of water, and they would prove to be Toya Maru's undoing. Her machine space is flooded, her engines died, and she was soon completely without any power or any control. For 3 hours, the ship was battered about by wind and huge seas until she finally came to rest at 10:30 PM, aground off Nanae Beach, only 4 kilometers, or just shy of 3 miles backwards from where she'd set out hours earlier. With monstrous, strong waves battering the ship's hull, the danger was plain. Although the town of Hakodate was agonizingly close by, the shore was just 100 meters away, the ship was stuck in the shallows and gradually being thrown over onto her side. Just 15 minutes or so after grounding, Toya Maru was capsized and flooded quickly. The ship's lifeboats broke their lines and were washed clean away, along with tons of equipment and flotsam. For those on board, escape and survival was a tragic matter of simple luck. There were around 1,300 people on board, and the next day it had become clear that just 150 had survived. This remarkable footage shows Toya Maru capsized in the relatively shallow water, the ship's underside pointed at the sky, while meanwhile the Nanae beach was littered with debris including the ship's boats and a life preserver. A party of 35 American GIs, artillerymen from the 1st Cavalry Division, had been aboard, and only one survived because he was luckily swept out of the ship's hull through an open porthole. The Toya Maru wasn't just the only casualty of Typhoon Marie. 4 other ferries were sunk and many other ships were beached, like this cargo vessel which is lying less than 100 meters away from the Toya Maru's overturned hull. In the end, the rough state of the Tsugaru Strait and the frequency of bad storms expedited the construction of a tunnel, the Saikan Tunnel, which today operates a high-speed Shinkansen service spanning some 14.5 miles, or 23.3 kilometers under the sea, and the dangerous woman who calls the storm. Of course, huge storms are not just unique to Japan. Massive seas have taken down ships across the globe, and in 1960, a huge North Atlantic storm broke a tanker clean in half. Pine Ridge was a tanker built for the US Merchant Navy during the Second World War, a time of booming industry for the nation as it rushed to output as many ships as possible. In the end, America's shipyards built an incredible 6,000 odd hulls in just 5 years of wartime as part of the emergency shipbuilding program. Now, the speed at which these ships could be constructed is incredibly impressive. In fact, a full Liberty ship, some 7,000 registered tons and 441 feet long, could be launched just 24 days after the keel was laid. But with the rush of increased output came some serious quality control issues. The quickly employed workforce lacked years of welding experience, and the result was often poor weld seams that were prone to cracking under extreme stresses. Now, this might not be an issue if the ships were designed to mitigate cracks or at least control them to radiate them away from vital sections of the ship's structure, but big open shafts like cargo hatches with their sharp squared corners became a natural stress and failure point, and this was not accounted for in the ship's design. And on top of all of this was the quality of steel. That used at the time was fairly brittle by today's standards. Back in December on this channel, we examined the story of the steamer Schenectady, which had snapped cleanly in two while she was tied up at her fitting out wharf. Throughout the war, there were 1,500 recorded examples of brittle hull fractures on the likes of Liberty ships, and 12 of those broke spontaneously in half. Now, the cause was attributed to something called the ductile brittle transition temperature, which is a certain point at which cold water can change steel's character from that of ductility, that is, being fairly flexible, to brittleness, more prone to cracking. Of course, the frigid North Atlantic Ocean was behind this, and subsequent ships were built with design changes to accommodate for it. But even so, ships built during the war exhibited some dangerous characteristics, especially in North Atlantic storms. Tankers like Pine Ridge were long and narrow. In tall waves and troughs, they could have monumental forces concentrated at their centers. In 1952, a storm had caught 2 World War II-era tankers, SS Pendleton and Fort Mercer, which both broke apart and sank with the loss of a combined 14 lives. Well, years later, in 1960, it was SS Pine Ridge's turn. On a trip from New York to Corpus Christi in ballast, that is not loaded with her cargo of fuel, the tanker was caught in massive seas and wind. Off Cape Hatteras, the ship was battered and thrown around until finally it all became too much. With a disturbing crack and a huge groan, the ship was broken cleanly into 2 sections which quickly separated. The bow section, with 8 men, including the ship's captain, sank, and the men were lost in the storm. But curiously, the stern section's watertight bulkheads held up, and the 28 men aboard anxiously awaited rescue. After the dangerous conditions had died down, this incredible footage was taken, showing the weird side of Pine Ridge's decapitated stern section floating dead in the water. Fortunately, the majority of the ship's crew was rescued by the aircraft carrier USS Valley Forge. The ship's stern was found to be in a good state of seaworthiness and was towed slowly home at just 3 knots, eventually making it into Newport News shipyard with her flag flying at half-mast out of respect for her 8 lost men. The shipbuilders at Newport News got to work, and the stern was welded to numerous other components to make a real Frankenstein's monster of a ship. The forward bow section of the T2 tanker Redstone, and the midship section of the T3 tanker Sachem The result was a new ship named Meadowbrook, which returned to service 2 years after the disaster to enjoy another 20-odd years at sea before scrapping in the 1980s. Finally, we'll return to the waters off of New Jersey, which is a real hotspot when it comes to maritime incidents and disasters. Here in 1934, passers-by and residents were drawn out in their thousands by the horrible sight of an ocean liner burning stem to stern on their doorsteps. Captured on camera for the world to see, the liner Morro Castle was a scorched and tangled wreck, almost within spitting distance of onlookers on the shore, and 137 of the vessel's passengers and crew were lost. How the Morro Castle came to be in such a sad state is a fascinating story that begins some 4 years earlier, in 1930, with her construction and launch. Built for the American Ward Line, Morro Castle was an intermediate passenger liner of 11,500 gross registered tons, with a 480-foot or 146-metre length, and turbo-electric propulsion that could drive her through the water at a steady 20 knots. With a capacity for around 490 passengers, Morro Castle was designed to quickly and efficiently carry holidaymakers and business people, mail and general cargo alike, to Cuba from the US mainland. The route was a popular and profitable one, so Morro Castle and her sister Orient were built with luxurious standards in mind, with 2 classes for passengers, featuring elaborate lounges, sumptuous cabins and clean, elegant public spaces. The ship was the latest thing in technology, equipped with direction-finding navigational systems, and eventually a gyro compass and echo-sounding equipment, making her a vessel ideal for navigating those difficult waterways on the approach to New York. Morro Castle was capable of making the voyage to Havana in under 60 hours. For 4 years, she had a happy career, doing well for her owners and providing American travellers the rare treat of enjoying a drink in public in lieu of Prohibition's alcohol restrictions. But all of that came to a crashing and dramatic end in September 1934, when the ship was making her return voyage to New York from Cuba. On September 5th, as the ship steamed away from Havana with 549 people on board, the weather began to turn, and by the 7th, as the ship was trundling along up the eastern US coast, heavy rain had rolled in, and big swells began to make Morro Castle pitch and roll. That night, the ship's captain, Robert Wilmot, had had his dinner inside his cabin, but crew and officers were shocked shortly afterwards when he suddenly died of a heart attack. It was an incredibly ill omen for the usually happy ship, and just a small portent of the horrors to come. Morro Castle's chief officer, William Worms, assumed command, and the ship continued on as the winds and the seas picked up. All seemed well as the ship approached the entrance to the channel that would take her to New York City, and with just 8 miles or 13 kilometers to go, at 2:50 a.m. on the morning of September 8th, a passenger complained to steward Daniel Campbell that he smelled smoke. They were in the smoking room at the time, but with not much else to do to pass the time, Campbell began to hunt for the source of the smell, and then, in the first-class writing room on B-deck, he spotted smoke pouring from out of a small locker that held paper, pens, and uniforms. Now, Campbell got hold of a nearby fire extinguisher and opened the locker to try to put the fire out, but instead, it surged with the influx of oxygen. By the time the bridge was made aware, several crewmen were throwing buckets of water into the locker to try to stop the blaze as passengers looked on. Alarmingly, the flames began to flicker down, out of the locker, and onto the carpet and the lush drapes of the writing room, rising up to the ceiling and beginning to rage out of control. Soon after, the room had to be evacuated, and as crewmen struggled with a fire hose and hydrant, the fire raged white hot. They couldn't know it at the time, but it was being fanned by the ship's comprehensive ventilation system, usually a blessing for ships operating in hot tropical climates, but up top, where the wind and heavy seas were raging, huge volumes of fresh air were being vented down to fan the flames. Morro Castle's elegant wood panels and sumptuous furnishings were gobbled up by the fire as it quickly spread, and by the time an indicator panel on the bridge lit up to show the presence of flames, it was already too late. As the fire spread throughout the ship, crews at fire hydrants and hoses were dismayed when their water pressure vanished because the system was overwhelmed by the sheer number of hoses in operation at the same time. With the ship burning out from under his feet, acting Captain Worms knew that he only had a little time to act. He wanted to beach his ship on the nearby Jersey shore, but soon the main switchboards throughout the vessel had been burnt out and the power cut out completely. Then, the lines leading the ship's wheel and telemotor to the steering gear and rudders were burnt, and all control over the vessel and the huge swell was lost as well. Now lit brightly like a beacon in the dark, Morro Castle drifted and burned as passengers and crew desperately tried to get lifeboats over the side and away. Only 6 of her 12 boats could be launched against the terrible listing and rolling of the ship in those huge seas. The next day, at about 7:30 p.m, New Jersey residents were stunned to see the hulk of Morro Castle wash up on their doorstep, still smouldering in the darkening evening light. The ship had burned completely through with such incredible speed that passengers had become cut off from escape and were forced to make a terrible decision: burn or jump. Swimming in those conditions was a near impossibility, but still, passengers and crew were forced to jump for their lives, leaving whatever clothes or possessions they had at the ship's stern railing. Morro Castle loomed large over the Asbury Park beach, and she smoked and hissed as the fire continued to glow hot. 135 passengers and crew were lost in the disaster from the complement of 549, a toll which could have been far higher were it not for a rescue effort from a handful of passenger ships and smaller boats which braved the big swells. This incredible footage was shot from the nearby town of Asbury Park, where the Morro Castle had beached herself. Thousands came out to see her, and camera crews captured terrifying footage of the charred corpse of this once proud ship. Now, Morro Castle deserves a much bigger and more comprehensive retelling, something I'm keen to do on this channel in the future. Suffice it to say, the subsequent inquiries and investigations have sparked well-founded conjecture and conspiracy theories ever since. How exactly a fire came to break out inside a locked cupboard in the middle of the night was, and still is, unknown, but the fire was eventually dismissed as something of an act of God. William Worms, the chief officer, and others were charged with negligence, but they had their charges thrown out on appeal. The details surrounding the events leading up to the fire, the captain's untimely and unexpected death, and the outbreak itself are murky and very ominous. Captain Wilmot had died after eating his dinner and complaining of stomach pains, but he'd also supposedly claimed earlier that some unnamed person on board the ship had meant him harm. Chief radio operator George Rogers was hailed as a hero of the disaster. He told investigators that his assistant was the likely culprit, but with a lack of evidence, the investigation met a dead end. Shockingly, years later, Rogers was involved in a bizarre plot when his commanding officer, Lieutenant Vincent Doyle, was blown up by a mysterious package. The investigation into this crime brought Rogers' criminal past to light, which included poisonings and a spate of mysterious fires. Now, Rogers got a 20-year sentence for the attack on Doyle, who survived, albeit with permanent disabilities, but he only served 4 years. He was later found guilty of the bludgeoning murder of an elderly couple, and he died in prison. Doyle maintained for years that he thought Rogers had set the fire aboard Morro Castle. Today, many think that Rogers was behind the Morro Castle's loss, but the fact is that all evidence was destroyed by the fire itself as it swept through the ship, fueled by that highly flammable interior decor, the glued timber and the shiny wooden veneers. The crew's handling of the fire was found to be incompetent, and it's largely to blame for the number of lives lost, although, in their defense, the outbreak of a blaze, in the middle of a storm at sea in the dead of night, is a difficult set of circumstances to work with. The idea of arson on the part of Rogers is an attractive one, but a former engineer also put forward the theory that the blaze was the result of overheated uptakes, those large pipes that funnel smoke from out of the ship's boilers and into the tall funnels. With the rush of fresh air thanks to the storm, it was, he thought, likely that the uptakes had overheated and glowed red hot, that the cabinet in the writing room was just close enough nearby to the uptakes and the fire was caused by the transfer of heat. Whatever the case may be, the Morro Castle remains as one of the most dramatic shipping disasters to take place off the US coast, and the remarkable image of the towering ship burned through looming high over the New Jersey beach is one that is difficult to forget. Post-war London. Thousands of fans are jostling to get a glimpse of their idol, an overnight sensation back on British soil after a spell in Hamburg. Police line the arcing pavement of Finsbury Circus, standing shoulder to shoulder outside the imposing Victorian edifice of the Danish Club. Inside, their hero is taking to the stage. The crowds have been glued to their radios for weeks, desperate to hear his voice crackle through. Suddenly, a throng pierces through the police line, shoving the bobbies aside to get a few precious steps closer to the man of the hour. But this isn't a pop star we're talking about. It's the captain of a cargo ship, a short, stocky Dane named Henrik Kurt Carlsen. About a decade before Beatlemania was born, Carlsen Mania was here, and it was sweeping the globe. Carlsen had been the captain of a humble freighter named Flying Enterprise, a World War II cargo ship which had been doomed for obscurity had disaster not struck. In 1952, the ship was caught in a shocking storm and began to sink. For days, Carlson and his crew fought hard to save their ship as newsreel cameras captured the entire thing on film, and the world held its breath. Stuck hard over onto her side, smashed by enormous white waves, all the odds were against Flying Enterprise, and her captain had his work cut out for him. With cargo shifting in her holds, the ship was at risk of flipping over entirely. Could she be saved? Or would the vessel roll and take her valiant crew down with her? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this is the true story of the SS Flying Enterprise and her unlikely celebrity captain, Kurt Carlson. Flying Enterprise had humble beginnings. It was one of thousands of ships built for wartime use by the United States Maritime Commission, the same government agency that was responsible for the Liberty and Victory ships. The Commission led the biggest merchant shipbuilding effort in world history, one that made an indispensable contribution to the Allied war effort. But launching so many vessels in such a short amount of time meant sacrificing quality for quantity. Liberty ships, in particular, became infamous for suffering hull and deck cracks, in some instances snapping in half without warning. Flying Enterprise, or Cape Kumikaki as she was first christened, was a Type C1 cargo ship, and these differed from the Liberty and Victory classes in important ways. They were the smallest of the three, and they were designed for short routes, where high speed and capacity were less important. The first C-Series vessels were designed before hostilities broke out, and they were built beyond the exigencies of war. They were meant to be commercially viable ships that would help reduce US reliance on foreign shipping. Liberty ships were based on C1 plans, but they were altered to make them even cheaper and quicker to build, and, at the same time, bigger by every measure. Plates that had been riveted together were welded instead, letting the cracks spread unimpeded throughout the hull. As Flying Enterprise's story would eventually show, though, that didn't mean cracks were out of the question. In 1946, Washington passed the Merchant Ship Sales Act, allowing the sale of surplus war-built merchant vessels to domestic and foreign buyers. The next year, Cape Kumikaki was sold to the New York-based Isbranston Line, the leading American-flagged shipping company servicing the eastern seaboard and the Mediterranean. Renamed Flying Enterprise, she began her new life as a general cargo freighter, transiting the North Atlantic. Flying Enterprise's fateful final voyage began on December 21st, 1951, at the port of Hamburg. On the banks of the River Elbe, stevedores winched a dizzying array of cargo into her 5 holds. This included pig iron, Volkswagen cars, antique French furniture, priceless musical instruments, Swiss watches, carpets, gherkins in brine, a collection of Japanese ivory figures, scholarship applications from German students, maybe even weapons of mass destruction, if the conspiracy theorists are to be believed, but more on that later. Heavy fog crept in as the Flying Enterprise rode the evening tide out of Hamburg. Spiked mines from the Second World War still bobbed in Europe's sea lanes, while remaining ordnances were marked with warning buoys. Plotting a safe course through pea soup meant that for 30 hours, Carlson never took his eyes off the smoky water. The fog held all the way into the English Channel, swept away at last, after a string of sleepless nights on the bridge, by something far more dangerous. 4 days out of Hamburg, on Christmas Day, the Enterprise flew right into the maw of a terrible storm, the worst the Atlantic had seen in half a century. Passengers and crew tried to celebrate with a turkey dinner, but as the festive lights swayed above, the captain's table was empty because Carlson was back on the bridge. Hurricane-force winds whipped the seas southwest of Ireland into a frenzy. On Boxing Day, one tremendous wave smashed into the ship's port side, what in later retellings would be dubbed a rogue wave. Down below, the engineers were thrown across the ship. Carlson, mid-shave, lurched to the side. Passengers bounced out of their bunks. Although they didn't realize it at the time, this single wave dealt a fatal blow to the Enterprise, critically wounding the vessel at its weakest spot. As night turned into day, waves continued to froth and spit at the injured ship. The sky and the sea merged into a seamless, roiling grey, distinguishable only by the foaming whitecaps that surged through the mist. The din of the breakers and the howling of the wind were deafening, but, for just a second, all these sounds were drowned out by an even more terrifying noise, an explosion. bursting from amidships and emanating from across the entirety of its beam. Crewmen likened the sound to a gunshot, followed by a loud thump from below, as if the 6,700-ton freighter had just been picked up and dropped back into the sea. Upon inspection, Captain Carlson and his officers discovered a crack in the hull, just aft of the midship's house. It started just over a centimetre wide at the port side and then snaked clear across to the starboard side, where it widened to nearly 8 centimetres. This must have been a dark omen, especially on one of the Merchant Marine's mass-produced wartime vessels. At this point, though, the ship was still on an even keel, and all the seawater had been pumped out of her. They still believed they'd be alright, after repairing the crack with canvas and cement and reducing speed, if the storm would just let up. But let up, it did not. At the same time that Flying Enterprise was battling the storm out at sea, things were hardly better on dry land. Gusts over 165 kilometres an hour, that's 102 miles per hour, were tearing through southwestern England, smashing small craft at their moorings, ripping away piers and flooding seaside streets. Dozens of ships foundered all along Europe's western seaboard. From Scandinavia across to the Iberian Peninsula, the entire continent was getting blown away. Making for land wouldn't necessarily be the Enterprise's salvation. It could even be her doom. Anchored offshore, if they failed, she'd be chewed up by the rocks. Carlson informed his bosses of the crack, but stopped short of sending an SOS seeking immediate assistance. He was still confident his ship could weather the storm out at sea. Yet, there were already rumblings below deck. The men were asking why a distress call hadn't been made, and why the ship wasn't making a beeline for the nearest port. The repairs seemed to be holding up, and the Enterprise was making headway. Carlson kept the bow pointed toward New York, angled so that the storm's severest blows could be blunted by her less damaged port side. But then, on December 28th, the unthinkable happened. A monster wave, thought to be about 20 metres tall, almost 100 feet, loomed over the freighter. When the wall of water rammed into her starboard flank, it stoved in the wheelhouse windows, shredded one of the 2 lifeboats, and ragdolled everybody on board. The sound of glass exploding and metal rending ripped throughout the ship. The impact knocked out electrical power, cloaking the cabins and passageways in darkness. By the time passengers and crew got to their feet, they found that reality had shifted. Their world was now tilted at a 25-degree angle, and it would never be right again. Carlson tried to swing the ship around to starboard, but the rudder wouldn't respond. He ordered full speed ahead, but a tinny voice rattled up the voice pipe. The plant had been kicked out, and Flying Enterprise was dead in the water. It was at this moment that Carlson sent out an urgent mayday. Encountering severe hurricane, he said. Situation grave. Have 30-degree list and just drifting. The reported position was 530 kilometres southwest of Ireland's Cape Clear Island, an Atlantic graveyard where the ocean runs roughest and deepest. As night fell, the situation got worse. Water was rushing into the number 3 cargo hold, and as the cargo began to shift, the angle of the list only got more dramatic. Carlson ordered all of the Enterprise's 48 crew and 10 passengers to abandon ship. Due to the angle of her tilting decks, though, the freighter couldn't actually lower its own lifeboats. One of them had already been smashed to pieces by the waves, but the other one swung loose and uselessly. Instead, they'd have to wait until other ships arrived, and then leap into the churning froth to be plucked out of the waters by their rescuers. A US Navy vessel, the troopship General A.W. Greely, was the first to acknowledge Carlson's distress call. Then, the Norwegian SS Westfall Larsen said she'd reach Flying Enterprise by morning. 2 more Norwegian vessels also said they were proceeding in their general direction. 2 British ships, the MV Sherburne and the SS Warhawk, also offered to help. Carlson replied to their requests and queries, saying that the ship's limp had steepened from 25 to 30 to 45 degrees, but now at least half a dozen ships were converging on Enterprise from all directions. The British and the Norwegians were the first on scene, arriving in the pre-dawn darkness. Carlson told the ships to keep their distance. He had lost all power, and he didn't want to mount a rescue operation at night when all of the ship's lights were out, and survivors, bobbing like corks, could easily be lost in the abyss. Carlson asked the flotilla assembling around him to stand by until daylight, and as morning broke, the wind eased and a few nervous slivers of sunlight peeked out through the gloom. Passengers were asked to fetch warm clothes from their cabins and muster in the starboard corridor, where they were issued with life jackets. Seasick, scared and shivering, they were eager to get off their limping vessel. But that was easier said than done. Remember, there were no lifeboats. Carlson assured them that help was coming, but they might need to swim for it. Crew members had rigged ropes and ladders to help passengers climb up the sloping and swaying decks to where the captain stood, waiting for them on the boat deck. The tanker, Westfall Larsen, spewed oil into the rescue area to try and calm the waves. When Carlson spotted their first potential rescuers, a lifeboat from the freighter Southland, he began to summon the passengers one by one. Women and children first, must have felt more like a burden than a blessing in this case. But staying true to the Birkenhead drill, Carlson ordered Elsa Mueller to make the first jump. Wearing only a nightdress under her coat, the 55-year-old mother climbed hand over fist along the ship's rail to where the captain stood under the useless lifeboat. He handed her the end of a rope that disappeared into the cauldron below. He assured her that there was a lifeboat at the other end, hidden behind a curtain of spray and a restless mountain range of rolling swell. As they crested a wave, Carlson caught a glimpse of the waiting lifeboat and tapped Elsa's shoulder, the signal to jump into greater danger, seeking safety. When she surfaced, Frau Mueller wiped the oil from her eyes and lost the rope. As her husband and 2 children looked on, she found it again and pulled. The Southland men drew her in, but then began to return to their own vessel. As they battled through the waves, Mueller, desperate for help, kept repeating one of the few English words that came to mind: children, children. Agonizingly, though, she would have to wait. Her rescuer, Southland's second mate, feared being swept in under the Enterprise's overhanging hull, and his captain agreed. Sherburne was next up, but her boat's crew couldn't get close enough to Enterprise, and they beat a retreat as well, capsizing on their way back to the mothership. Even the rescuers now needed rescuing. It was up to the Warhawk, but her lifeboat never even neared the wallowing freighter, having capsized almost as soon as it touched the water. Thankfully, both the Sherburne and the Warhawk men were all saved by their own ships. Southland's crew bravely decided to make another go of it. The little lifeboat was so tossed about by the sea that half the time they couldn't even see the flying Enterprise, since they lay so deep in the waves' troughs. But thankfully they managed to haul Elsa out of the roiling ocean. Now, it was Leanne, her daughter, who was waiting to jump from the boat deck. Without a line for the 19-year-old to cling to, Carlson made a slight change to the rescue plans. From now on, a crew member would accompany each passenger, jumping hand in hand into the water and awaiting rescue. As visibility waxed and waned, 2 people would be easier to spot than 1. This method worked for Leanne, her 11-year-old brother Lothar, and several other passengers. Altogether, Southland's lifeboat saved 11 passengers and crew, including all of the women and children on board. The Navy ship, the Greeley, arrived and launched her first motorboat at 9:45 a.m, managing to heave 7 men from the sea. But as they were heading away from the Enterprise, the lifeboat's engine failed. The officer ordered the oars manned, but they could make no headway. Instead, they made for the Southland, which lay downwind, and the survivors were taken on board. The lifeboat, though, was bashed heavily against the Southland's hull, and it had to be winched aboard with a cargo crane. Greeley then launched a second boat, but as they neared the Enterprise, they saw 4 figures leap into the water, and then immediately get thrown back aboard by the smashing waves. They were eventually washed astern, where the lifeboat picked them up. One hadn't made it. 54-year-old Nikolai Bunyakovsky was the only fatality in the operations. Greeley's officer, realizing that it was safer to have survivors jump from the stern, instructed them to move aft before urging them to jump. On their second trip, the lifeboat picked up at least 16 people still aboard the flying Enterprise. The Navy ship's radio man reported a full number of survivors, then asked, "What about the captain? When is he leaving the ship?" Carlson signaled back, "I'm the captain, and I'm not leaving." And so began the most exceptional part of the Flying Enterprise saga, Captain Carlson's 12-day-long epic last stand at the helm of his limping freighter. His determination to stay with his ship as long as it floated was an incredible gesture, and it was one that would eventually inspire interest and admiration from across the globe. But to him, it was much more than that. It was a decision based on purely pragmatic concerns. He wanted to maintain command of Flying Enterprise, at least until a tugboat arrived to take her under tow. It wasn't a doomed or futile effort to Carlson either. He sincerely believed that his ship actually stood a good chance of making it back into harbour, as long as the tug arrived soon and did its job well. And one was about to make it to the Flying Enterprise well ahead of her own ETA, the Dutch tug Ocean. But unfortunately for Carlson, though, Ocean was diverted at the last minute to rescue her sister ship, which had collided with a cargo vessel it was towing to safety off Brittany. The French tug, Abai 25, motored out of Calais to look for the Enterprise, but turned back when she saw the full fury of the Atlantic. When his Branson line brought Carlson up to speed, he agreed that the Abai 25 just wasn't powerful enough. Enter Turmoil. Homeported to Falmouth on the Cornish coast, the plucky British tug was the most powerful tugboat in the world, at least according to her owners. She was already towing a shell tanker caught in the storm. Flying Enterprise wasn't yet a wreck, but it must have felt like one, with the vast, empty corridors tilted at impossible angles and swilling with icy water. Everything had to be done by torchlight. Carlson scavenged around for parts of the ship that were still accessible and above water, but he found little in unspoiled supplies. The thumping of waves, the clanging of metal, and the howling of the wind through the shattered windows formed a kind of ghoulish symphony. On December 30, a Navy observation aircraft took off from southwest England to search for the floating hulk. When they found her, the Navy pilot swooped in low and snapped a photograph, a striking image of a single, solitary speck of a man atop a drifting, dreary wreck. Some enterprising soul passed it on to the press, and it electrified Fleet Street. It was a story too good to be true, an old salt's one-on-one fight to the death with the ocean itself. What Carlson couldn't have known was how he'd bumbled into yet another storm, this one a media kind. When survivors stepped down the gangway at Rotterdam and Liverpool, they were met by reporters. The Flying Enterprise story was capturing the world's attention. It was first-page news, not just the day of the rescue, but virtually every day thereafter. Carlson's coverage was getting the 1950s equivalent of live tweeting or the 24-hour news network. Every new development deserved a headline. When there wasn't anything new to report, journalists ferreted out family members, salvage experts, or meteorologists for their analysis and projections. The world was on the edge of their seat. Could he pull it off? London's newspapers admiringly nicknamed him Captain Stay Put. At last, on January 3rd, the Turmoil pulled out of Falmouth Harbour in pursuit of its latest casualty. Carlson was determined to stay on Flying Enterprise at least until the tug arrived to begin towing the ship. While a spokesman for the Branson line said that Carlson's gallant stand was motivated by, quote, traditions of the sea, it can't be denied there was a very practical consideration behind it. His staying behind prevented the very likely chance that the ship might be seized by salvors as a derelict. When a crew abandons their ship, it becomes fair game for salvage firms who become entitled to a portion of the value of the ship and her crew. Admiralty law tends to be kind to salvors, and with good reason. There should be incentives to save ships and sailors in distress. Some salvage crews knew which danger areas were most likely to result in a wreck, and they patiently waited for their chance to rush out and secure everything that they could. In this case, Turmoil and her captain, Dan Parker, weren't just opportunistic scavengers. They'd been engaged by the Branson line to bring in Flying Enterprise, meaning that they had already agreed on the terms of the deal. What those terms actually were is as much a mystery now as it was then. But word had it that it was a harsh, high-stakes, no cure, no pay arrangement. If Turmoil's crew didn't get the Flying Enterprise to shore, they wouldn't see a cent. This question, too, was the topic of spirited conjecture. A Times article was headlined, "Salvage Experts Become Popular," noting how the previously obscure industry was suddenly the topic of dinner-time conversation worldwide. On January 3rd, back at sea, the USS John W. Weeks, a destroyer, had arrived on scene. They managed to zipline a care package over to Carlson. And then, close to midnight, the Turmoil arrived as well. The tug and the Navy destroyer blared their sirens to alert Carlson. After one near miss trying to attach a tow cable in the dead of night, they decided to try again at first light. Conditions at sea were still incredibly difficult, and tethering a line to the rolling, yawing Flying Enterprise presented even more challenges. There was only one man on board, and thanks to the state of the ship, he had to hold onto something at all times, leaving only one hand spare. The standard method of shooting a cable was also out of the question, since the freighter was transporting huge sacks of highly flammable naphthalene, a volatile organic compound that could ignite the ship like a giant bomb if a rocket landed nearby. Instead, the tug would have to get up close and toss him a line by hand. As ever, the press corps offered breathless coverage. The New York Times devoted half a page to Carlson's lone battle against the sea, detailing 3 unsuccessful attempts to get the tow rope over to him, as well as disclosing tantalizing details like what food was sent over by the Navy destroyer. Incidentally, it was sandwiches, coffee, and some candy, which I'm sure was appreciated. Radio listeners got to hear the captain himself recounting his epic. The rescue ship Golden Eagle had made a 25-minute recording of Carlson's voice when he spoke to them over the ham radio. The next day, Friday, January 5th, the wind and the swell finally had died down. Despite multiple attempts, the line just couldn't be attached. Carlson nearly lost a limb to the backlash of a rampant metal cable. Turmoil's captain, Dan Parker, and his first mate, Kenneth Dancy, agreed that Carlson needed help. 27-year-old Dancy won this difficult job due to his sturdy build, newspapers reported, an attribute belied by his listed hobbies, which included knitting and classical music. The question of just how exactly to get him over to the ship was resolved when both vessels' sterns were pushed up against one another by a swell. Dancy quickly leapt across, grabbing onto Enterprise's taffrail and jumped from one vessel to the other. Well, less a jump and more of a step, really, as Dancy would later say. In that moment, the Flying Enterprise's complement effectively doubled, but so too did their chances of successfully attaching the tugboat's hawser. But more than ever, it was a race against time. The holds were taking on more water all the time. Already half buried by the ocean, the ship's list was getting more and more pronounced, and its bow was also digging deeper into the icy white waves. Luckily, Dancy seemed to have brought good weather with him. The next morning, the wind was down, and they were harried by only sporadic fog and a light drizzle. It was the calmest the water had been since Christmas Day. The 8th time was the charm. With help from his new surprise first mate, Carlson managed to thread the line through his ship's fair leads. The 2 men stood back and waved. The turmoil growled into forward gear, the long steel cable playing out before them, and finally, Flying Enterprise was no longer adrift. Progress, however, was painfully slow. Turmoil was towing the Enterprise at a sluggish 3 knots, barely walking pace. But still, things were looking up. W.L. Thompson, captain of the destroyer John W. Weeks, estimated that Flying Enterprise had a 75% chance of making it. When the destroyer pulled into Plymouth Sound to refuel, Commander Thompson stood on the torpedo deck to take questions from the press, but all they wanted to know about was Carlson. That night, USS Willard Keith, another destroyer that relieved the Weeks, reported that Enterprise was 190 miles from Falmouth and its captain was in fine spirits. Carlson's parents had flown across the North Sea from Denmark for a hero's welcome that awaited their son in the port. Mobbed by reporters at London Airport, they said they were certain Kurt would succeed. In a recorded message on Sunday night, Captain Carlson's father said, "We are all with you in our thoughts, Kurt. Good luck. We know you will get the ship in safely now." Everybody was rooting for him. The jubilant mood on shore was reflected at sea. Carlson and Dancy had Sunday dinner delivered by line from the Keith. Steak, hot coffee, fruit and cookies, as well as cigarettes. The men found clean, dry clothes and turned in for a well-deserved sleep. All hands patient, rested and hopeful for continued favourable weather, the US Navy Greyhound reported after speaking with Carlson over the radio. The destroyer's captain, Commander Leslie O'Brien, added one final prophetic word of caution. He warned that the weather might take a turn for the worse. As dawn broke on Tuesday, January the 8th, Flying Enterprise passed the 2/3 mark in its 480-kilometre tow to Falmouth Harbour. The ship's list went from 65 to 85 degrees when a passing wave kicked it in the gut, just 5 degrees short of lying flat on her side. But for now, the weather was still looking good. The 2 vessels were still expected to make landfall by the afternoon of the next day. Airplanes circled overhead, while merchant ships transiting the English Channel slowed to crane their necks at Captain Stay Put and his tilting Flying Enterprise. Carlson's convoy had become something of a floating tourist attraction. Back in London, the US Navy's Eastern Atlantic headquarters, housed in a red brick building at Grosvenor Square near the US Embassy, continued coordinating control of the rescue operation. The commanding officer, Rear Admiral Walter F. Boone, praised Carlson's courage and his modesty, though he cautioned that he and Dancy had no more than a 50-50 chance of survival if the vessel capsized. The 2-room public relations office in Navy HQ remained open at all hours to satisfy the British public's great interest in Carlson's fate. It issued daily bulletins from Commander O'Brien that acted as press briefings. Such was the interest in the story. The triumphant atmosphere was pleasant while it lasted, but come the afternoon of the 8th, it was washed away by yet another man-eating Atlantic storm. Parker and Carlson agreed to sit it out, and the foul weather passed after dark, but the hours she spent wallowing in the water meant she lost the momentum that had been keeping her afloat. When they got moving again, she rode even lower in the water and pitched harder with each passing swell. After a brief respite, the weather worsened once again. On the morning of January 9th, they awoke to find that the tow line had snapped. Attempts to fix it saw Carlson hurled across the deck by a 12-metre wave and nearly dragged under the water. By morning, the wind was eking back up to gale force. The flying Enterprise was nearly on her beam ends. Even Carlson admitted to Dancy and said, "She won't last." Britain's RAF dispatched a helicopter to pluck the 2 men from the sinking ship, but the merciless wind forced it back. On Flying Enterprise, the ship seemed to be crumpling under Carlson and Dancy's feet. Explosions thundered below as the pressure building up inside the ship was blowing the watertight doors and the hatches that had long been battened down. The 2 men stood barefoot on the starboard rail, the highest point still above the water. That was the point that they had originally planned to jump from, but as the ship began to settle on her side, they decided the drop was too dangerous. Instead, they began inching along the now horizontal smokestack, half submerged, letting seawater surge into the ship's bowels. Flying Enterprise only had minutes left. Carlson and Dancy stood on the lip of the funnel as if it were a diving board. Picking their moment, they jumped into a receding wave. Carlson a split second after Dancy, ensuring that he was still the last man to leave his ship. The wave carried them clear of the rigging and the debris, but they were powerless to swim over to the turmoil. The tug jockeyed around until she had the 2 men on her starboard bow, then lowered a rope ladder and tossed out some lifelines. Dancy clambered aboard first, but Carlson was so exhausted from his 12-day final stand that he needed to be lifted up by the lifeline he clung to. He still had enough strength, though, to stand up on the deck and say to the crew, "You've done a good job, boys." And then, to Dancy alone, he said, "I wish I had 10 mates just like you." Then, in true British fashion, the 2 were led below for a restorative cup of tea. Flying Enterprise gurgled down to the lower depths of the ocean at 4:10 p.m, just 40 minutes after Carlson and Dancy had jumped. It was a sad end for the ship. After 12 days of battling the elements, she was less than 80 kilometres. That's 49 miles from shore. But at least she went out with a bang. As she slipped beneath the waves, flares that had rolled off the deck somewhere ignited. The ships surrounding her sounded funeral blasts on their sirens. An ocean away, at the Isbranson Line's head office in Manhattan, a ship's bell rang out for their fallen freighter. Today, the Flying Enterprise is just one of the thousands of shipwrecks littering the bottom of the English Channel. She lies on a bed of sand and shingle under a ghostly blanket of abandoned trawlers' nets. She rests as she sank, still on her port side, some 72 kilometres out of Falmouth Harbour in Cornwall. Carlson ultimately failed to save his ship, but that didn't seem to matter to anyone but him. He still received a hero's welcome once he got to shore. The bells rang out, whistles still blew for him in Falmouth Harbour. The banquets, the speeches, the award ceremonies, it all went ahead as planned. Carlson felt all along that he didn't deserve the honours. "I feel I've not accomplished anything," he insisted to reporters. "It would have been a different story if I'd brought the Flying Enterprise into port. As it is, I just tried to do my duty." Yet it was precisely that devotion to duty that endeared him to so many. But Carlson was not without his naysayers. At the Coast Guard inquiry that convened just a few days after the sinking, 3 unlicensed crew members contradicted their officer's testimony, laying blame squarely on the captain. One of these men opined that the ship's hull had cracked thanks to the misstowage of its cargo. This was the age before containers, when goods were still handled manually, stored in warehouses, moved to wharves and then lowered by cranes or carried by hand into the hold and packed away by dock workers. The heaviest items were still loaded amidships and along the ship's centerline. This was crucial for the ship's balance and trim, allowing the bulky cargo to act as ballast, preventing excessive pitching or rolling in rough seas. But overloading the ends could also result in hogging, where the hull is bent downwards, straining the vessel to a potentially disastrous degree. Captains ultimately bore responsibility for ensuring that the cargo was loaded correctly. On Flying Enterprise, the heaviest cargo should have gone into Hold 3, just ahead of the engine room, where the ship was built the sturdiest to accommodate its 4,000 horsepower engine. But the pig iron was mainly in Holds 2 and 4, while a consignment of mail from US servicemen stationed in Germany went into number 3. This could have catastrophic consequences, making the ship more susceptible to capsizing, cracking, or even cleaving the hull clean in half, like other ships that had been mass-produced for the US Maritime Commission already had done. Another of the critical crewmen asked why Captain Carlson had immediately alerted his bosses to the ship's plight, but he had waited over 24 hours to issue a distress call. The third man demanded to know why Carlson hadn't turned back to the nearest harbour as soon as the crack had developed. At the time, that would have been Brest, on the Brittany coast, France's second largest military port. Well, another one of Carlson's haters had an answer. According to Red Fleet, the official publication of the Soviet Navy, it was all a nefarious American plot. Flying Enterprise wasn't carrying iron, cars, or typewriters, the magazine hypothesized, but weapons of mass destruction, specifically parts for a V-2 flying bomb and other forbidden armaments that had been manufactured in West Germany. It was just a few years out from the end of the Second World War, and the idea of Germany already rearming would not have sat well with Washington's European allies. Or so the Soviets said. The Soviets weren't the only ones raising suspicions about Flying Enterprise, though. Other observers found it suspicious that 2 US Navy destroyers came to the ship's rescue, postulating that she must have been transporting some special cargo like gold bars or zirconium, which was used to clad nuclear fuel rods. A confidentiality clause in the salvor's license, swearing them to secrecy about what they recovered from the seabed, pushed the rumour mill into overdrive. Of course, this is all the stuff of unsubstantiated conspiracy theories, but Carlson did have answers for the other more credible broadsides aimed at him. He told the Inquiry that the cracks opened up in the decks by the lashing of the gales. They had, quote, nothing to do with the ship's sinking. It was crippling, a 60-foot sea that heaved the freighter over, broke her rudder, and possibly shifted, he said, some of the cargo of pig iron ingots, pushing her further onto her side. The ship just never recovered from the list, Carlson said, and the subsequent storms that continued to batter the vessel forced her over until finally she capsized. After the cracks had appeared, Carlson said his first concern was to ride out the storm, which pushed him towards the Cornish coast. He considered making for a French port or running down to the Azores, but the towering waves and howling wind were so bad that all he could do was keep steerage way. As for the 24 hours that elapsed between his informing his employers of the situation and sending out that distress call, he said that he was awaiting orders from New York. The inquiry, which was convened to determine whether there was any negligence among the crew of the Flying Enterprise, and if their licenses needed to be suspended, found that there was none. Carlson would soon be at sea again. While the inquiry played out in the newspapers, covered as obsessively as a celebrity trial, Carlson's fans wouldn't let this rain on their parade. That's just not a figure of speech either, they really were planning parades for him. In New York, Carlson was to march up Broadway at the head of a 2,000-man column that included hundreds of cadets from the Merchant Marine Academy and contingents from the Navy, Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, Air Force, and police and fire departments, all with their own regimental bands. 700 more police were assigned for crowd control. At City Hall, a stand was erected to resemble the bow of the Flying Enterprise, replete with a metal smokestack flying signal flags that read, "Well done." Throughout the whole state of New York, January 16th was declared Captain Henrik Kurt Carlson Day. This red carpet reception was the biggest party New York had thrown since welcoming home Allied Supreme Commander Douglas MacArthur in 1951. Back in Carlson's hometown in New Jersey, his family was forced to move to a secret safe house to escape the relentless fanfare and press coverage. The mayor put aside nearly $20,000 in today's money for his own ticker tape parade, which he declared would be the greatest turnout in the town's history. Before Carlson could even make it back to America, though, he was already getting hounded by his adoring British fans. The captain was surrounded by admirers from the moment he stepped off the train in London. From the Danish club, where thousands of people pushed through police lines, he made his way to Lloyd's of London to receive their silver medal for gallantry. The beating heart of world maritime news and insurance came to a standstill for the ceremony. Captain Carlson continued working for American export Isbranson Lines for another 24 years, taking command of the Flying Enterprise II, creatively named, just a few months after his ordeal. After retiring in 1976, he operated a small launch for the Raritan Yacht Club in Perth Amboy, near his modest hometown of Woodbridge, New Jersey, staying close to the roar of the sea but far from the din of the crowd. So, why on earth was the world so enraptured with Carlson's saga? Well, consider the times. It was 7 years since the end of the Second World War, that apocalyptic struggle against an unambiguous evil. Decades of more war lay ahead, but the Cold War was a different beast. That was an age of secrets, spies and subterfuge, double agents and defectors. Maybe the public was sick of learning about the nuclear bomb. Maybe they just wanted some good old-fashioned heroics. In Carlson's battle against the very sea itself, there could be no doubt who was the good guy. No blurred lines between courage and cruelty. Unlike others of his generation, Carlson wasn't a war hero. He was a hero without bloodied hands. He'd saved everyone and killed no one. He was a simple hero for an increasingly complicated and morally ambiguous age. What Kurt Carlson really represented was something of a Rorschach test. 1952 was an election year in the US, and some saw his tale as a kind of political allegory. A letter to the New York Times asked, what if legislators, what if men holding elective power over their fellows, what if candidates showed in their conduct the quality of courage that Carlson and Dancy showed? A man who will risk his life at sea would probably risk his money, his reputation, or his career if he thought his duty called on him to do so. Let us look for men who would, if necessary, battle for a doomed cause if that cause itself were good, and not leave their ship as long as a mast remained on which to fly the flag. Others saw the Flying Enterprise story as an antidote to post-war moral malaise. We have, all of us, been troubled, another letter to the Times read, days upon end, by doubts of values. We have often seemed to live in a world of little meanness and monstrous depravities. It's good for us, therefore, to get the clean, sweet salt air of heroism blowing once more in our faces. If we're happy and grateful that Captain Carlson has done his job supremely, it must be partly because we're reassured that dignity, courage, and individual worth are still with us. We take comfort in knowing that the age of loyalty is not dead. Today, Kurt Carlson is far from a household name, but for those who know, there are still occasions to remember him fondly. Like, for example, when the Costa Concordia struck a rock off the Italian coast in 2012, or when the MV Seawall sank in Korean waters 2 years later, taking hundreds of people down with it. These were instances when captains abandoned their ships, their passengers and even their own crews off the bat to ensure that they reached safety on land before anyone else. These stories shocked and appalled us today, as they would have done back in 1952. And when tragedies like this happen, it's hard not to imagine why, for a brief moment in the 1950s, the whole world fell for Captain Stay Put. On April 11th, 1912, the paddle wheel tender America drew alongside RMS Titanic as she lay anchored off Queenstown, Ireland, the final stop before the big liner began her first ever transatlantic crossing. Photographers took the opportunity to snap the ship from stem to stern as she lay at anchor in the sunlight and the smaller vessels tied off. America disembarked third-class passengers bound for the New World, and they stepped aboard excitedly in a line, and then the tender began to transfer bags of mail to the enormous liner, part of the critical postal link between Britain and the United States. Crucially though, mail, letters, and postcards written by passengers aboard Titanic were transferred back to the America. These surviving letters give us a haunting glimpse into the life of some of the liner's crew and passengers, and within 4 days, many of the writers would be lost in the sinking. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and these are some of the real tragic letters posted to, about, and from the Titanic. Mail was important to big ships like Titanic. For one, the mail contracts that linked Britain and America had driven the development of the ocean liner as a thing to begin with. At sea, passengers were encouraged to pen letters, safe in the knowledge they'd be posted at the first possible convenience. But even before Titanic sailed, she was being written about, no less than by the very man that helped design her, Mr. Thomas Andrews. Andrews has become a legend, not just because he headed the design team for Olympic and Titanic, but because of his selfless actions when his creation began to founder. In 1912, Andrews, originally from Combe, Ireland, was 39 years old and working hard at his dream job, a career that he had shaped over the course of 23 years at the Harland & Wolff shipyard, Queen's Island. He'd begun as a 16-year-old apprentice with the yard back in 1889 at the joiner's shop and ended up the manager of construction works by 1901. Andrews was a fastidious hard worker, but he was also very well liked by the yard's labourers for his geniality and his thoughtfulness. Signs of Andrews' considerate nature can even be found today on the Titanic's wreck. Installed at the top of the ship's twin firemen's ladders can be found a drinking fountain, ideally placed by the designer to quench the thirst of soot-coated stokers at the end of a long shift. In 1908, Andrews, having overseen the construction and the launch of hundreds of ships, was appointed managing director and head of Harland & Wolff's drafting department. So it was that in 1909, when the White Star Line approached the firm to commence designing a trio of new superliners, Andrews was to be the vessel's chief planner. Andrews fell in love with Helen Barber, Nellie as he called her, and shocked her with an engagement ring one night in 1906. The next day he penned a heartfelt letter to her, and he said, "My dear Nellie, I cannot tell you how much it grieves me to feel that I frightened or gave you any annoyance last night." Andrew's fears were misplaced though. The two were married in 1908 and Helen soon fell pregnant. One night, Thomas took Nellie to the deserted slipway where Titanic sat unfinished and soon to be launched. There can be no question that Andrews was proud of his ships. He joined Titanic at Belfast and the delivery voyage to Southampton, where he wrote a few notes back to Nellie, saying, "I wired you this morning of our safe arrival after a very satisfactory trip. The weather was good and everyone most pleasant. I think the ship will clean up all right before sailing on Wednesday." After frantic preparation, during which Andrews was seemingly busy with every single minute detail, Titanic was at last ready. In his final note home, Andrews wrote, "The Titanic is now about complete and will, I think, do the old firm credit tomorrow when we sail." He completed a final inspection of the ship, farewelled his colleagues who were staying behind, and said, "Remember now and keep Mrs. Andrews informed of any news of the vessel." With the engines thundering, Titanic drew away from the quay and set off on her first and last voyage. Andrews was clearly very pleased with Titanic, and he spent much of the voyage penning notes to improve on the ship's design for the third and final sister, Britannic. The notes he kept on Titanic are lost to the sea, but we can get some sense of Andrews' attention to detail from those he had made for Olympic just a year prior. In a notebook, he had written, "Would propose fitting 11 additional 4-seated tables in first-class restaurant as per plan, this room being short of table accommodation. A screen to be an improvement if fitted on the side of the restaurant buffet entrance door so as to prevent passengers from seeing behind the buffet. Linoleum tiles not to be fitted in the captain's sitting room, in which a full room carpet has been provided, and sponge holders to be fitted in the private bathrooms on B and C decks where these have been omitted." When Titanic struck the iceberg, Andrews famously conferred with Captain Smith and confirmed that the vessel would soon be lost. His actions that night are fairly well documented and were extensively covered by the press. Rather than save his own life, Andrews distributed lifebelts to passengers and urged the importance of their use. He seems to have been one of the few who actually gave third-class passengers, trapped below in the ship's labyrinthine corridors and passageways, any thought at all, and he set about guiding groups of them up to the boat deck for evacuation. He was last seen in the vicinity of the bridge when the vessel took a final plunge from the surface, and his body was never recovered. Nellie was devastated by the loss of her husband. Her daughter, from a second marriage, recalled that she was obviously very, very fond of him. "I think," she said, "it was a true love match. He must have been brilliant. But the other thing that comes out so often is his real affection for the workers." He told Nellie when they were driving out of the shipyard one day together that all the workers who were coming out were his mates. He was so very popular and dearly loved, I think, by so many people. There are a number of famous coincidences regarding the Titanic sinking, but one which is particularly tragic is the little-known story Mr. Ramon Artagavetia from Uruguay. Artagavetia was born in 1840, and as a young man, he'd survived a terrible disaster at sea. On Christmas Eve, 1871, Ramon was aboard a steamship, the SS America, engaged in a race against another vessel into Montevideo Harbour. It's thought that the excess pressure on the ship's boilers led to a fire, and America was soon engulfed. Of 164 passengers, only 65 survived the inferno, and many were badly burned. Artagavetia jumped for his life. He was fished from the sea and was emotionally distressed by what he had experienced. Writing to a cousin, Ramon later explained, "Nightmares keep tormenting me. Even in the most quiet trips, I wake up in the middle of the night with terrible nightmares and always hearing the same fateful word. Fire, fire, fire. I've even gotten to the point where I find myself standing in the deck with my lifebelt on." In 1905, Ramon took over the family farm in Argentina, living a relatively peaceful life. But it was in 1912, 41 years after America had been lost, that Artagavetia decided to face his fears again and travel, by ship, to visit his family in Europe. Fascinated by the technological marvels present on modern liners, he wrote, "You cannot imagine, Enrique, the security the telegraph gives. When the America sank right in front of Montevideo, nobody answered to the lights asking for help. The ones that saw us from the ship Villa del Salto did not answer to our light signals. Now, with a telegraph on board, that won't happen again. We can communicate instantly with the whole world." With a successful trip behind him, Ramon booked passage for home aboard the latest steamer, White Star Line's Titanic. Boarding at Cherbourg, France, he wrote some final letters home that were posted from the ship. To one family member he wrote, "I closed my eyes and went aboard in this huge ship. One of the carriers took my suitcase and brought it to the 3rd floor. We went to the dining room, Saloon C. My cabin is very comfortable. It's heated by electricity. It's on during the night because it's very cold." From the ship, Ramon wrote a long description to his brother. "My dear Adolfo, yesterday from Cherbourg I've sent a postcard to Elisa, and as soon as I arrive in New York, I'll telegraph Manuel, if they don't take it to you, because I only put R. Artagavetia on it. The desire is to see North America, although at full steam and seduced by the size of this 45,000-ton steamer that makes its first voyage. I closed my eyes and embarked." Everything I say about the ship falls short. Yesterday, as we approached on the steamer, it was cool as the Rio de la Plata, and when I looked up, I had the feeling of being at the foot of a 5-story house. Upon entering, there were about 50 waiters. One of them took my bags, and by elevator, there are 3, we went up to my floor on B deck. The dining room is on D deck, and there are others below. The room is very good, with an electric stove which I keep on all night because it's cold. Today it is sunny, but we're going northwest to Queenstown, Ireland, to dispatch correspondence, which will make us delay the trip, which I take advantage of in order to ride. The dining room is for 500 or so people. Yesterday we were only 340, having a width of 30 meters. The steamer is wider as there are still corridors on the sides. The food was very good, and there were plenty of dishes. Last night we were a Mexican, congressman, and doctor friend of Diaz, still young, a Spaniard, and a very serious English lady and American lady. I toured what I could of the steamer and its different rooms, and today, to find this one to write, and since there are more than 2, it was hard for me. The corridors are painted white, and some rooms, like this one, are made of carved wood, oak, I think, with green, velvety, satin sofas and chairs. Everything is new and rich. The promenade is 647 feet on one side, and there's an open space which was full of sun today. And there is another promenade, somewhat smaller, so you can walk about 340 meters without turning around. Then there are the bow and stern, the steamer being 260 meters long. For the description of the steamer, I'm letting you know what might attract your attention. I'll see if I put my notebooks together. But I notice that it stops, and I see nearby land, Ireland, so I end this letter giving you all my memories and hugs. Your brother, Ramon. So it was, after 40 years, Mr. Artagavetia was to be confronted with disaster at sea once more. With word quickly spreading throughout the ship of some kind of trouble, Ramon and 2 Uruguayan shipboard companions, Francisco Corral and his nephew Jose, made their way to the boat deck where they were spotted by a fellow first-class passenger, Elmer Taylor. The men were laughing at Ramon's taking the situation so seriously, but soon, as the gravity of the disaster began to hit, the mood changed. Taylor later wrote that, about halfway up the flight, on the way to the boat deck, there were 2 gentlemen, one on either side leaning against the balustrade, and from outward appearance looked more dead than alive. We'd been introduced to these 2 fine-looking men by a mutual friend on the platform in Waterloo Station. They were from Buenos Aires, Argentina. They could not speak English, and we could not speak Spanish. As we casually met day by day, we'd all speak our native language, smile and pass along, none of us understanding what the other one said. At this meeting, we repeated the usual salutations, shook hands and assured them there was no danger, smiled and proceeded on our way to carry the fear they exhibited on their faces for the remainder of my life. How terrifying it must have been to those who did not have faith in the wonderful engineering skill displayed in building this massive, unsinkable steamer. A week following the Titanic's sinking, the cable vessel Mackay Bennett, on a mission to recover bodies left behind on the surface, recovered that of Ramon Artagavetia. His remains were returned to Montevideo where he was interred, and his final letter reached his brother, who kept it the rest of his life. Titanic's second class was comprised of a wide spectrum of people, with passenger occupations varying from clerks and shopkeepers to business owners and schoolmasters. Percy Bailey, 18, of Cornwall, followed in his father's footsteps and became a butcher's assistant. In 1912, Percy received a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. A friend of his father's, based out of Ohio, offered him a precious butcher's apprenticeship. Excitedly, Bailey went to book a crossing on the Oceanic, but changed to Titanic at the last minute when he learned that a few of his friends were crossing too. Boarding Titanic at Southampton on April 10th, he sent this touching letter home to his parents. Dear Father and Mother, we arrived on board this morning after a night's rest at Southampton. We had several people joined us at St. Erith, bound for the same place as we are going, so we are a big family all together. Well, dear Mother, I suppose you are missing me, but don't be downhearted. Old dear Percy will be behaved to you as a son ought to treat his mother and father. This going away from home will make me a better man, and make me try and lead a good life. The Titanic is a marvel, I can tell you. I've never seen such a sight in all my life. She is like a floating palace, everything up to date. I hope you are well as it leaves me at present. Father, I shall never forget your kindness. You have done more for me than many fathers have done for their sons. Well, dear parents, I don't think there is any more news I can tell you now. Kiss Grandma for me and tell her I'm sorry for all my wicked thoughts which I said to her, but never again will I cheek her. Give my best love to all who ask for me, and tell Ethel to come and see you any time. I'll draw my letter to a close, hoping you, one and all, are quite well. I remain your loving son. Bailey was lost when Titanic sank, along with the 2 other young men with whom he shared a cabin. His body, if it was recovered, was never identified. Across the ocean, at the destination Percy had never reached, flags fluttered at half-mast, and his uncle recalled how proud the young man had been to be sailing on Titanic's maiden voyage. Also in second class were 7-year-old Eva Hart and her parents, Benjamin and Esther. The family boarded at Southampton, another case of those who'd been shifted onto Titanic sailing because of the ongoing coal strike. Writing back to family at home, Esther penned a letter that didn't get posted from Titanic at Queenstown. Instead, she'd written it on April 14th, the day Titanic struck the iceberg. She wrote, "My dear ones all, as you see, it's Sunday afternoon, and we are resting in the library after luncheon. I was very bad all day yesterday, could not eat or drink, and sick all the while, but today I've got over it. This morning, Eva and I went to church, and she was so pleased they sang, 'O God, our help in ages past.' That is her hymn, and she sang so nicely. So she sang out loudly, and she is very bonny. She has had a nice ball and a box of toffee, and a photo of the ship brought her today. Everybody takes notice of her through her teddy bear. There's to be a concert on board tomorrow night in aid of the sailors' home, and she's going to sing, so am I. Well, the sailors say we've had a wonderful passage up to now. There's been no tempest, but God knows what it must be like when there is one. This mighty expanse of water, no land in sight, and the ship rolling from side to side is wonderful. Though they say this ship does not roll on account of its size, anyhow, it rolls enough for me. I shall never forget it. It's very nice weather, but awfully windy and cold. They say we may get into New York Tuesday night, but we are really due early Wednesday morning, so shall ride as soon as we get there. This letter won't leave the ship, but will remain and come back to England where she's due again on the 26th. Where you see the letter all of a screw is where she rolls and shakes my arm. I'm sending you on a menu to show you how we live. I shall be looking forward to a line from somebody to cheer me up a bit. I'm always shutting my eyes and I see everything as I left it. I hope you're all quite well. Let this be an all-round letter, as I can't write properly to all till I can set my foot on shore again. We've met some nice people on board, Lucy, and so has been nice so far, but oh, the long, long days and nights. It's the longest break I've ever spent in my life. I must close now with all our fondest love to all of you, from your loving S. And down the bottom, a small note. Heaps of love and kisses to all, from Eva. Esther was not an easy traveller, and she stayed awake all that night. So alert was she that the slight bump in the middle of the night had set her to worry, and she got Benjamin to investigate. He quickly whisked his young family into a lifeboat and stepped aside so more women and children could get in. Esther and Eva, wrapped in a blanket, survived the night bundled in the small boat as it drifted on the ocean until morning when Carpathia arrived to rescue them. But when all the boats and survivors had been gathered, it was clear that Benjamin was not among them. He'd placed a jacket around Esther's shoulders, and afterwards she'd found her letter still in the pocket. Esther and her daughter returned to England, and Eva struggled with nightmares for years until finally Years later, as a young woman, she booked a trip to the Far East and locked herself in her cabin until the nightmares went away. She lived a long and full life, right up until the age of 91. Also in Titanic's second class was Edgar Andrew, 17. He had been born in Argentina to British parents, and having left the Americas to study in Bournemouth, England, the lad was invited by his brother, Alfredo, to attend his wedding in the USA, and then stay on for a working position in New Jersey. He booked passage aboard Oceanic, but like so many others, fate was to intervene, and the coal strike saw many of White Star Line's ships temporarily mothballed, and the teenager was transferred instead to Titanic, which was due to sail a week earlier. In a letter to a friend, Josephina Conway, Andrew opined, "You figure, Josie, I had to leave on the 17th this month aboard the Oceanic, but due to the coal strike, that steamer cannot depart, so I have to go 1 week earlier on board the Titanic. It really seems unbelievable that I have to leave a few days before your arrival, but there's no help for it. I've got to go. You figure, Josie, I'm boarding the greatest steamship in the world, but I don't really feel proud of it at all. Right now, I wish the Titanic were lying at the bottom of the ocean." Those prophetic words would likely haunt Conway for the rest of her life. Fellow Titanic passenger Edwina Trout, then 27 years old, had met Edgar on board as the two shared the same table for meals. Years later, having never discussed the sinking, she finally broke her silence and recalled that on the night of the disaster, she'd come across Andrew. The teenager was wearing his life belt, and although she was 10 years older than him, Edgar took it off and gave it to her. He was lost in the disaster and his body was never recovered. But in 2001, 89 years after his death, Edgar's neatly packed suitcase was discovered lying on the sea floor at the Titanic wreck site, as if waiting to be retrieved by its long-lost owner. In first class, there were the Holversons, Alexander, an American businessman, travelling with his wife, Mary. The pair were returning home from a long vacation, which had seen them travel through South America before sailing for a stay in England. On April 13th, when Titanic was mid-ocean and only 1 day from disaster, Alexander penned his mother a letter on shipboard stationery, intending to send it once they landed in New York. "My dear mother, we had good weather while we were in London. It's quite green and nice in England now. This boat is giant in size and fitted up like a palatial hotel. The food and music is excellent, and so far we've had very good weather. If all goes well, we'll arrive in New York Wednesday morning. I'm sending you a postcard of the ship and also a book of postcards showing the inside. We've not had any news since we left New York January 6th, so we don't know what's been going on since we left. Mary's sister was ill when we left and had an operation performed out of New York. Mary had a letter from Mr. Berry at Buenos Aires, which stated that she was getting on fine, but we've not heard anything since. We've been so far away that it's been hard to reach us with mail. Mr. and Mrs. John Jacob Astor is on this ship. He looks like any other human being, even though he has millions and millions of money. They sit out on deck with the rest of us and are very democratic. Well, I guess I'll write more another time." The Astors, probably the most well-known passengers aboard and definitely the wealthiest, were returning to America after having fled a scandal. John Jacob Astor had married a woman 30 years his junior, and New York society was in uproar. Holverson's letter would never be properly posted either. After ensuring that Mary had been put into a lifeboat, he had remained on the ship, and he had perished. His body was among those recovered and identified by the cable ship Mackay Bennett in the week following the tragedy, and the letter was found still inside his coat pocket. Another hero of the Titanic was Wallace Hartley, the ship's band leader. Titanic actually featured two separate ensembles, a more informal trio which would play at the B-deck entrance to the ship's first-class restaurant, and a formal quintet led by Hartley, who played in large public spaces before or after meals. The musicians weren't actually White Star Line employees. Instead, they were contractors of the agency CW and F.N. Black, who supplied orchestras to many ships of the time. Wallace Hartley's actions on the night of the disaster have passed into legend. The two bands combined, and under Hartley's leadership, they played waltzes and ragtime to calm passengers as they evacuated the ship, but not one of the musicians survived. On April 10th, the day of Titanic's sailing from Southampton, Hartley sent this quick note back home. "My dear parents, just a line to say we've got away all right. It's been a bit of a rush, but I'm just getting a little settled. This is a fine ship. There ought to be plenty of money on her. I've missed coming home very much, and it would have been nice to see you all, if only for an hour or two, but I couldn't manage it. We have a fine band, and the boys seem very nice. I've had to buy some linen, and I sent my washing home today by post. I shall probably arrive home on the Sunday morning. We're due here on the Saturday. I'm glad Mother's foot is better. Wallace." Hartley's body was recovered by the Mackay Bennett, still in possession of his violin case. The violin itself had been a gift from his fiancée Maria in 1910, and it was returned to her. Hartley's body was transported to Lancashire for burial, where he was greeted and mourned as a hero. Another letter that was posted at Queenstown had come from none other than the personal secretary to White Star Line's chairman, Mr. J. Bruce Ismay. William Harrison was 45 years old, a former clerk who worked directly for the head of the line. It sounds like a job that would give great benefits, but clearly, for William, the novelty had well worn off. He penned this startlingly relatable letter back home to his wife. "My own dear Nancy, just a line before we get away from Queenstown to let you know how I'm getting on. I had a most rotten journey to London from Manchester to Derby. I travelled third class, 12 in the compartment. The train was absolutely packed, people standing up in the first and third class dining cart who had to be cleared out into the corridors before they could have dinner. They told me that some people never sat down all the way, although I got into a first class compartment at Derby and had to have the seat with the arm turned back, which is not the most comfortable in the world. We were an hour late into St. Pancras, getting there at 11 o'clock. Those who travel much by rail these days are learning not to expect too much. I got down quite comfortably this morning and found the boss in good shape. We started in, and I had to work all the afternoon writing letters to post at Queenstown, and I expect another dose in the morning. We have 318 first-class passengers, quite a small lot for this ship, but I haven't seen any of them yet with being so busy. I have a seat at the purser's table again, and there is W.T. Stead, the great writer on social subjects there too, quite an old chap now. All the rest are men. There is of course very little difference between the Titanic and the Olympic, only a few improvements. We're just getting up to Queenstown, and I have just a few minutes to finish off. I didn't get to bed till after midnight getting things ready for Queenstown. If there are going to be any trips in future, I am fed up, and I shall avail of any opportunity he gives me to stay behind. And the amusing part of it is that people think it's a holiday. I thought I saw that solicitor from Warrington we met at Monaville last year passing the carriage at Liverpool. While you were there, did you see him? I think the fool who sat by me was drunk. He rode nearly all the way with his head out the window to cool his hot head, I should think. I suppose Tom turned up all right in spite of your fears, and I hope you got home in good shape. I wonder if you have started that cleaning which worried you so much. You do seem to take some things so seriously these days. Why is it? I'm sure everything is the same than it has been for years. There, dear, I've told you all that has happened to me. Nothing interesting, as Nellie says. Now it only remains for me to say goodbye, with best love and lots of kisses for you all, and to remain your own faithful, devoted Will. During the sinking, William's movements are largely unknown, but what's much better documented is the survival of his boss. Ismay found a place in a lifeboat after having helped on the starboard side getting boats away, but Harrison and Ismay's valet, Richard Fry, both died in the tragedy. Harrison's letter gives us a fascinating glimpse into what it was like to work for the big shipping lines in the early 1900s, and it shows us that in many ways, corporate life hasn't changed a bit. One final note deserves publishing, that of 10-year-old Mary May McMurray. On April 13th, she had sent a letter to her father, William, from the family home in Liverpool. William signed on to Titanic as a saloon steward, and he was lost in the ensuing disaster. This touching letter stands as a poignant reminder, not just of those who would never return home, but of the beloved families they left behind. Dear Father, it seems ages since I last seen you. I wish we were in Southampton with you. It is very lonely without you, dear Father. I've not been so very well. I've had a bad throat. Hoping I'll soon get better, for Mama worries so much. Little Ernie has not been so well, but he's got better now. Hoping you are keeping well, Dada. So tar, love from Ivy and Ernie. Thanks, Dada, for the presents. Love from all, Dada. Hoping to see you soon. With love from Ivy and May and Ernie. And then, after a dozen kisses, she ended with the note, Dada, this is my first letter. A massive ship cuts its way through the ocean at speed. It's 1931, and this mammoth new Oceanliner is on its sea trials. She's the largest ship in the world by far, 80,000 tons and over 1,000 feet long, an absolute behemoth. This is the White Star Liner Oceanic, the answer to a threat posed by German, Italian and French shipbuilders. For years, British merchant shipbuilding had progressed just fine, but a British-built ship had not held the title for the world's largest vessel since Titanic, way back in 1912, almost 20 years earlier. But now the same company that had owned Titanic introduced Oceanic, a triumph for British shipbuilding and an engineering masterpiece. Except, none of this ever happened. The Oceanic was a real project, but she would never be finished. It's an epic tale of greed, illegal dealings, poor planning, and just sheer bad luck, which would mean Oceanic would be abandoned after construction had started and be lost to history. Her story is intertwined with the death of the White Star Line itself. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this is the true story of the Oceanic, the White Star Line's unfinished superliner. This was a crucial year for the White Star Line. This was one of Britain's premier shipping lines, and famously, or rather infamously, they were the operators of the RMS Titanic and her sister ships. The company had been doing swimmingly well in the 19th and early 20th century, dominating the transatlantic trade and faring well against its competitor, the Cunard Line, until April 1912, when the Titanic was lost. This was a devastating blow for the company, and it brought a number of massive changes. For one, J. Bruce Ismay resigned. He had been the chairman of the White Star Line and the president of the American company that owned it, called the International Mercantile Marine. Way back in 1902, Ismay had founded the company with 3 other huge shipping magnates of their various lines, big names like American, Red Star, Atlantic Transport and Leyland Lines. The whole thing had been bankrolled by financier J.P. Morgan, and the company formed agreements with German lines of the time as well. This left the Cunard Line standing alone in the face of an American-owned shipping juggernaut on the Atlantic trade. It received British government grants because of it. Then, in 1908, IMM's president Bruce Ismay proposed the concept of 3 new superliners to challenge Cunard Line's Lusitania and Mauritania. The result was Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic, 3 ships intended to re-establish White Star as the main force on the Atlantic run, but then it all came to a screeching halt. Titanic sank with Ismay on board, although he survived, and it became a public relations catastrophe and a major humiliation and shame to the IMM. But most importantly of all, Ismay was a shattered man. In 1913, he formally resigned from his position in IMM, but remained on as White Star's chairman, dedicating huge amounts of time to compensating Titanic survivors and victims' families. With Ismay gone for good from IMM, the company entered more of a slump. In 1913, its backer and owner, Morgan, died, and then a year later, the First World War erupted. dozens and dozens of their ships were lost, and financial troubles bubbled to the surface. The company went into receivership, but it was saved. Sadly, the same couldn't be said of their largest vessel, the brand new Britannic, sister ship to Titanic. She sank in 1916 after hitting a mine. IMM and the White Star Line in particular emerged from the First World War missing a massive number of ships, and they were in a precarious situation. But then a champion emerged, RMS Olympic, Titanic's older sister ship. She had survived the war and multiple U-boat attacks, even managing to ram and sink a would-be attacker. The ship took White Star Line into the early 1920s with a boom. I've actually done a video on this before. It's a really interesting bit of history. She was paired with the older, smaller, and slower Adriatic, which was a weird partnership, but one that would have to do because hundreds of thousands of people were fleeing Europe's carnage for new hope in America or Canada, or they went the other way to seek out loved ones and the life in the old country. With Olympic, a 45,000-ton superliner serving alongside Adriatic, a ship just slightly more than half that size, obviously something drastic would have to be done to maintain that regular, scheduled service the White Star Line's customers expected. Although the two ships were lucrative in that first few years after the war, Cunard Line was much better positioned because they had emerged from the war with two liners of Olympic's quality, namely Mauretania and the newer, magnificent Aquitania. It's probable that the White Star Line began to plot a running mate to Olympic at around about this time, something about the same size and capacity. But then, in 1920, the company purchased the German liner Columbus and renamed her Homeric. Fully overhauled, the ship went into service alongside Olympic in January 1922, but still, it was a weird pairing because Homeric was still about 10,000 gross registered tons smaller than Olympic and nothing like a true replacement for Britannic or Titanic. Now, later that same year, the company introduced the recently purchased German liner Bismarck, renamed Majestic. Now, this ship was actually bigger than Olympic, and at last, White Star Line had a pairing of ships that could tackle Aquitania and Mauretania. But Homeric was still the odd one out. Smaller, slower, and less glamorous, she still had a dedicated following, but she was nothing like the ocean-going celebrities that Olympic and Majestic became. White Star Line would need to build a third ship to operate with Olympic and Majestic to seal the deal and complete the dream that Bruce Ismay had back in 1908, a trio of superliners flying the White Star Line's flag. In 1923, the company approached Harland and Wolff, their longtime partner and shipbuilders, with a brief: design such a running mate, something that would meet the expectations of the travelling public and live up to the standards set by the glamorous Olympic and Majestic. In January 1926, at the height of the Jazz Age, Harland and Wolff submitted a plan for a liner that served the purpose. And their submission was, to put it very simply, quite weird. The ship would be an enlarged, modernised Olympic, sporting the same four funnels, although larger at about 905 feet in length and around 50,000 gross registered tons. The ship's stateroom layout and decorations would have been largely the same as Olympic. Probably the only major external difference was the introduction of a cruiser-style stern, which the company had employed on other ships like the Belgenland of 1914. This attempt at modernising the external appearance just didn't go far enough. Olympic's silhouette was unmistakably Edwardian, but that era had died with the First World War. Four-funneled liners were old hat. Whether this plan was ever seriously, formally considered is unknown, but we can probably assume the White Star Line, if they were ever presented the plans, rejected it. That same year, a second planned ship was presented, one which took modernisation much further. Gone were the four tall funnels, and in their place was a trio of squat stacks with an overhauled exterior. Now, this would be truly a ship for the 1920s and 30s. She was bigger again, around some 935 feet or 285 metres in length, and around 50 to 60,000 gross registered tons. The International Mercantile Marine's then president, Philip A. Franklin, excitedly proclaimed that the new liner would embody the best features of Olympic and Majestic and bear a family resemblance. She'd be capable of about 25 knots, which was a blistering top speed, putting her in league with the legendary Mauretania, which still held the then speed record. But IMM and White Star would push the concept even further because a third set of plans was presented by Harland and Wolff that called for an even larger ship. She'd be over 1,000 feet long and about 320 metres, the first ship to ever break the 1,000-foot mark. She would come in at a whopping 60 to 80,000 gross registered tons, and finally, for the first time in 20 years since Titanic had entered service, the largest ship in the world would be British built. She would symbolise a whole new era for the White Star Line, a company which had experienced a horrible run of bad luck. Therefore, she'd be named Oceanic, an important choice because it had been the name of the line's first ocean liner. But then, before keel plates could be laid and the plans seriously actioned, something happened that would already seal the new liner's fate. In the late 1920s, the International Mercantile Marine was in a strange place. It was receiving grants for American-flagged ships, and then relations with the British lines began to sour. The IMM wanted to separate from its non-American lines, and the White Star Line was put up for sale. And the very future of the company was at stake, right at the moment that they were announcing plans to construct their magnum opus, the wonderful new Oceanic. It's now that I have to introduce you to a very colourful character, the man who came to White Star Line's aid in 1926, but who would ultimately end up running it into the ground and going to prison. His name was Owen Phillips, Lord Kilsant, a businessman and a keen shipping magnate all himself. He'd started out as an apprentice at a shipyard in 1880, but went on to found his own shipping company with the help of his brother some 8 years later. And over the next 25 years or so, he went about growing his business, purchasing one shipping company after another, until he had controlling interests in no fewer than 20. In 1924, he became a chairman of Harland & Wolff, White Star Line's main shipbuilder, so as a shipping man he must have seen the White Star Line as the ultimate prize. When it came up for sale at the end of 1926, he swooped on in. When it was coupled with his other lines, Kilsant then became the head of the largest fleet of ships on Earth. Like an excited kid with a new toy, Kilsant was eager to grow White Star Line and see it flourish. He gave the company the monopoly on transatlantic voyages from Southampton, and even gave them 2 new ships from his Royal Mail Steam Packet Company. Of course, he was delighted by the idea of introducing the world's largest ship. Oceanic would be the crown jewel in his vast new shipping empire. But Kilsant wasn't totally happy with the design just yet. He knew that the Germans were working on something hyper-modern, designs that would eventually become the Bremen and the Europa. Oceanic was finally ordered in June 1928, and construction began 10 days later, but the design was absolutely wild. Oceanic would be over 1,000 feet long, but to keep up with the competition, she'd need to be fast too. As such, her service speed would need to keep pace with the newer designs being introduced around the world. So to achieve this, the Superliner would implement a radical new kind of propulsion. On conventional liners, boilers would turn water into superheated steam and drive it under extreme pressures into turbines. And then the fan blades in those turbines would drive a huge rotor connected directly to the ship's propeller shafts. This simple setup could harness the raw power of steam, but it had its limitations. For example, to go in reverse, it needed a complicated gearbox because the turbines could only spin in one direction, forwards. Steam was already beginning to be supplanted by a new form of propulsion anyway, the diesel engine. These monstrous piston engines were extremely efficient for their time, which was a huge benefit when Kilsant's shipping empire was in the throes of financial difficulties. We'll go through more on that in a minute. But diesel engines just weren't big and powerful enough yet to propel a liner in the 60 to 80,000 ton range. That would take a few more years of development. Oceanic would harness the new efficiency of diesels and the generative power of turbines and then combine them in a big way. The plan was for no fewer than 47 6-cylinder diesel engines to be coupled to generators, creating an enormous amount of electricity. Now these would then power 4 immensely powerful electric motors, providing a monstrous 200,000 shaft horsepower. Now the real benefit here, aside from the efficiency and the power, was the fact that the arrangement would do away with the complicated gearing, because the electric motors could operate in forward or reverse with ease. It would make the new ship extremely maneuverable, reliable, and cheap to operate. Kilsant was excited to implement the new propulsion system because it would mean Oceanic would be at the very cutting edge of technology for her day, aside from also being the largest and most luxurious ship in the world. But at that crucial moment, Harland & Wolff, the builders, refused. Even though Kilsant was the chairman, the key players that advised him were reluctant to use a new, untested propulsion system in such a big way. If it were to fail at that kind of scale, and in that sort of spotlight, it would be a disaster for everybody involved. Now, this kind of fear didn't come from nowhere because Harland and Wolff, and especially Lord Kilsent, had already just recently been embarrassed by biting off more than they could chew in exactly the same way. In 1926, Harland and Wolff had launched the liners Asturias and Alcantara for Kilsent's Royal Mail lines. The ships were powered by diesel engines, which were built under license by Harland and Wolff. But this was still relatively new technology. These were the world's largest motor ships. But at trials, the owners and builders were shocked to find that their new ships were badly underperforming. They were meant to be able to crack 18 or 19 knots, but they could only manage a pathetic 16.5, which was less than the old competitors' ships that were already in service on the same line. For example, French line's Lutetia could manage 20 knots, and she was almost 15 years older. It's a good thing Lord Kilsent was head of the builders as well as the owner of the flop ships, because otherwise, in a normal arrangement, the owners would flat out reject the builders' ships on delivery and the contract would go unpaid. Eventually, the pair would go on to be re-engined with more tried and trusted steam turbines, but in 1927, the failure was still fresh in the minds of Harland and Wolff, and it was a bitter one. Work on Oceanic was already going ahead slowly, but debates on the engines reached a head. In the end, Kilsent caved and a compromise was reached. Harland and Wolff were confident they'd learned their lessons with diesel engines, and they were keen to put them to use on a vessel of Oceanic size. Their proposal was accepted, and the Oceanic would be powered by 4 simply enormous diesel engines, each coupled to its own propeller shaft, using brute force to power the ship through the waves. This arrangement of diesels was aptly called the cathedral style because the engines stood so tall. It would make Oceanic the first 4-propeller-powered motor ship in the world, and by and away the largest motor ship yet built. It resulted in a peculiarity that would have been a funny characteristic of the ship though, because it would have meant that her forward 2 funnels would simply be dummies, and only the last one would have a light, wispy cloud of diesel fumes coming from out of it. The debate around the engines had a serious impact on construction. It had slowed so that only Oceanic's kill plates had been laid by 1929, while the issue was sorted out. And then, in October that year, the financial world shattered. The New York Stock Exchange collapsed and the world's major financial institutes were caught completely by surprise. The Great Depression had come at just the wrong moment for the White Star Line, and they and Oceanic might have survived, except that Lord Kilsent had been up to some financial trickery in the years before, in the hope that better years might see him and his shipping empire through. In short, Kilsent had come up with a model of acquisition. He would use large government loans to buy new shipping lines, and then use the revenue from those shipping lines to pay off the loan. But then he'd take other loans to buy other shipping lines, rinse and repeat. It had worked for a while, but by the mid-1920s, he was in some serious trouble. Loans were going unpaid, and the British government was beginning to put pressure on him. Right at the worst moment, with the government chasing him and his fleet of ships beginning to age, he had bought White Star Line and begun to spend even more. Maybe he believed that the company would be his salvation. Either way, he began to funnel funds into the company in the hope that it would grow exponentially. His eyes especially turned to Australia. He thought that a monopoly on that route would bring immense profit and financial stability, but it was a huge misstep. Kilsent spent a fortune buying shipping lines running to Australia, like Shaw, Saville and Albion Line, all the while covering his losses by moving funds around to make it look like everything was all right. The stock market crash caught him out. His companies defaulted on more loan repayments, and an investigation was launched. It revealed the sheer scale of his mismanagement. His company was £10 million in the hole. That's £537 million, or just over $1 billion in today's money. That's billion with a B. Not only had he been concealing that fact, but he'd actually been paying out dividends to stockholders despite trading at a loss. Now, this was deeply, deeply fraudulent behavior, and it became a national scandal. He was arrested, went to trial, and found guilty because of the comprehensive paper trail that he'd left behind. Kilsent was sent to prison for just 12 months, and although the sentence is hilariously lenient, it was a death blow for the Oceanic, and especially the White Star Line. Throughout that whole debacle, the poor old Oceanic had sat unfinished on the stocks with just her keel plates, her backbone riveted in place, but not yet recognisable as a ship. To prevent corrosion, the assembly had been coated in a grease, but with Kilsent's arrest and the devastating Great Depression in full swing, The loans taken out to fund the ship's completion were diverted to two smaller liners, Britannic and especially Georgic. We'll come back to her in a minute. Oceanic's great keel was broken up and the plates were recycled. The dream was finished. White Star Line had been caught in an awful position. Passenger numbers plummeted, and in simple truth, the line now had too many ships. The ships that they did have, by the way, were aging. Britannic, another diesel-powered motor liner, had been started before the Oceanic. Now funds for the cancelled project were put into her instead, and she entered service in 1930. She was the line's most profitable ship that year, but for the first time in its long history, the White Star Line recorded its first deficit. Then, another blow. The Australian government was owed a small fortune thanks to Kilson's reckless spending. They demanded repayment, but the White Star Line couldn't cough up. Their Australian-run ships were seized and sold to another company, and one by one the old White Star liners were sold and scrapped. Baltic, Megantic, the Cedric, they were the first big ones to go. Even budget cruisers couldn't save them. By 1933, the company was essentially bankrupt, but then an unlikely figure tried to come to its rescue. J. Bruce Ismay stepped in and lobbied to assume control. He suggested he form it into a new company that would run smaller, more profitable ships like the Britannic, but the idea came to nothing. In the end, the government would force White Star Line and their old rivals, the Cunard Line, to merge. Cunard had been working on their own Superliner project, but the work was halted, also thanks to the Great Depression. With the merger successful, and Cunard having the controlling interest, White Star Line's Superliner project, the Oceanic, was canned, and Cunard's ship was finished instead. She would go on to be named Queen Mary. White Star Line was never an equal partner in this relationship. Their champion liners of old, Olympic and Majestic, were retired. Olympic was sent to the scrap heap, and the Majestic was sold for a short stint as a training ship for the Royal Navy. The brand name was kept as a nod to tradition, but by the mid-1960s, no ocean liners were flying the White Star Line flag, and the name was finally retired for good. Oceanic had cost £150,000, that's £8 million, or nearly $10 million US in today's money. But today we barely have anything to show for it. The original plans for the liner, the first two drawings submitted in 1926, have survived, but the final general arrangement plan has been lost to time. In the Second World War, Harland and Wolff was bombed, so they might have been destroyed, or they could have been simply thrown out when the project was cancelled. But either way, today we don't even really have a very clear idea of what Oceanic would have definitely looked like, but between Britannic and her running mate Georgic, we can get some idea. See, when Oceanic was cancelled, the funds were put towards finishing Britannic, but the White Star Line still needed a new liner to run alongside that ship. For this new ship, Britannic's design was scaled up, and some elements of Oceanic's external appearance were put into her. The new ship was named Georgic, and she would be the last ocean liner ever built for the White Star Line. So what if the Oceanic had actually been built? Well, it's kind of hard in between Kilson's reckless spending and fraudulent activity and the Great Depression to imagine a world in which she would ever really be finished. Maybe if the construction had started earlier, if time hadn't been wasted arguing over the engines, she could have been in a much more advanced state of completion by the time the Depression hit. Cunard Line was always going to be the stronger company and have the controlling interest in such a merger. Financially, they were just in a far better state than the White Star Line, but crucially, at their head, they had the incredible, well-connected and savvy businessman Percy Bates. Maybe with the merger though, Cunard Line's Superliner project would have been cancelled instead. Queen Mary would never have existed as we know it today. Instead, Cunard would have assumed control over the unfinished Oceanic, and she might have entered service in the company's colours. It's a tantalising thought, but firmly in the realms of fiction. Oceanic was almost doomed from the start. She'd been ordered by an ailing company, her final stages of design were overseen by a financial delinquent, and she was killed by the worst economic crash in modern history. But generations of Oceanliner nerds like me still can't help but imagine a world where Oceanic was the queen of the waves and the largest, finest ship afloat.
Here the Queen Mary slides into Southampton after another transatlantic run. A royal lady come home once more.
Once upon a time, if you wanted to get anywhere in the world, across the roaring Atlantic midwinter, where the waves stand the height of apartment blocks, or way down to Australia over the Indian Ocean and its blistering sun, you would have to board an ocean liner. These magnificent pieces of technology were the toast of their era, and from the 1800s, when they were first introduced, until the mid-20th century they evolved and grew to gargantuan proportions. They served their respective countries heroically in wartime. They transported celebrities and migrants alike in their hundreds of thousands, and they cut the journey across the Atlantic from weeks and weeks to just 3.5 days. Then, they disappeared. Quietly in the background, a technological war had been waged. For half a century, the airplane had grown and evolved too, and then, when the ocean liner was right at its absolute height, the unthinkable happened. Almost overnight, the world's great ocean liners were made redundant. Passenger bookings dropped to nothing. Once celebrated ships were pulled unceremoniously from service and sat rusting awaiting their fates. Overhead, the roar of jet engines sang their swan song. Just how this played out, the key players and companies, is one of the most interesting technological tales of our times. It's a sad tale of redundancy, of what happens when the times move on and leave the marvels of the past behind. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this is how the ocean liner died. The New York Chelsea Piers. Since the turn of the 20th century, this was the gathering place for a veritable who's who of the world's largest and most glamorous passenger ships. From the Cunard darlings Mauritania and Lusitania at Pier 54, to the later magnificent Queen Mary and Elizabeth at Pier 90, the spectacular Normandy of the French line at Pier 88, and the record-breaking SS United States at 86. The ships that frequented these piers were celebrities in their own right, and they helped the piers earn their very apt nickname, beginning in the 1930s, Luxury Liner Row. In the post-Depression era, Luxury Liner Row was home to a near constant flurry of activity, as passengers of all kinds made their way to and from these grandiose vessels, with transatlantic services offered multiple times per week across several fleets of ships. These ships were capable of whisking travellers across the ocean in around 4.5 days, with the Speed Queen, SS United States, offering a trip across the Atlantic in a ripping 3.5. Most passengers look forward to their voyages, which in many ways were like holidays all of their own. Travel by sea had come leaps and bounds since the days of rickety and dangerous packet sailing ships, and in just a few short decades, luxury liners had evolved and transformed, making once dreaded sea travel a stylish and savvy way to cross the Atlantic. The steam engine meant big ships could propel themselves over the world's oceans at previously unthought of speed and regularity. Sailing ships had been doomed to sail only when the weather permitted, but steamships didn't have to worry about that, they could just forge ahead. The humble, fare-paying passenger could look forward to a relatively easy few days at sea, where every need was met, and then some. For the wealthy, it meant travelling in luxury that rivaled their favourite hotels ashore, like the Ritz and the Savoy. For the poor, it meant amenities and comforts few had ever seen before at all, like flushing toilets, electric lights, and 3 square meals a day. It wasn't just a matter of convenience either. Crafting the world's largest and fastest ships was a matter of national pride for their home countries, and celebrities and society's elite were all known to have their preferred ships, their favourite staterooms, and even captains, making a crossing on a luxury liner into a star-studded event. It wasn't just the transatlantic crossings either. Passengers could get all the way from England or America to Australia, New Zealand, or the Far East on a single ship on a single voyage. It'd take weeks, but it would be a comfortable and enjoyable escape, especially for those who weren't seasick. The ocean liner had enjoyed an unrivaled dominance of the world's ocean highways. It hadn't always been smooth sailing though, some tough lessons had to be learned along the way. There had even been attempted interlopers when Zeppelins had briefly offered transocean services, but that had eventually ended in disaster, and it wasn't pursued further. Ocean liners were the undisputed monarchs of the ocean, but then, in 1957, just south of Seattle, Washington, something momentous happened that would change the world forever. To understand this, we need to wind the clock back.
Comes Josephine in my flying machine, going up she goes,
Throughout the 1920s, while travel by steamship was just beginning to reach the heights of absolute glitz and glamour, aviation was still well in its infancy. Travellers around the world were becoming more and more curious about air travel, and buzz began to circulate as this seemingly futuristic bit of engineering started to gain widespread notoriety. But much like ocean travel in the 1800s, aviation at the time still left much to be desired. While they had come a long way since the days of the Wright brothers, helped along massively by the huge technological advancements gleaned in the First World War, early passenger airplanes were cramped, cold, noisy, slow, and dangerous. Many aircraft could only seat around 20 passengers at a time, versus the 1,000 or more that could travel at once on board an ocean liner, and the unpressurized and unheated cabins made flying a frigid affair, especially at higher altitudes. Passengers bundled up in hats and coats to combat the freezing air with almost nothing in the way of insulation to fend off the bitter temperatures outside. Frequent refueling stops extended already sluggish flight times. Passenger aircraft were also slow. Most could only muster around 100 miles an hour. Still much quicker than a ship, but then they needed to stop every few hundred miles to refuel. During the peak years of the ocean liner, travel by air was still prohibitively expensive too, with some trips costing about half as much as a brand new car. This meant that in its early years, flying remained reserved for only the most wealthy or daring of society, and daring they needed to be. Early aviation's safety record would give any traveller pause for thought. In the late 1920s, the accident rate was 1 aircraft lost for every million miles flown. Now, at the same rate, in today's world, that would equal around 7,000 fatal plane crashes annually. Navigational instruments were simple. Aircraft engines were relatively underpowered. They were completely at the mercy of the sky and its temper, and many simply disappeared. The aircraft showed promise, and the number of passenger flights slowly grew, but they couldn't yet hope to match the comfort and the luxury of the world's beloved palaces at sea. And by the year 1926, only 6,000 souls were brave enough to take to the air in these primitive commercial aircraft. Clearly, there was much progress left to be made if travel by air could ever hope to rival travel by sea. And the ocean liner enjoyed an easy lead because big ships could benefit from centuries of lessons learnt at sea, while the airplane was really breaking new ground. The 1930s saw some truly revolutionary aircraft begin to turn the tide though. The Boeing 314 Clipper, a flying boat aptly named after the great fast-sailing clipper ships of old, did something once thought only as science fiction when it carried passengers and mail across the Atlantic in 1939. Only a dozen were ever built, and the route took nearly 30 hours with multiple refueling stops, but for the 40 or so passengers it was the quickest way yet to cross the Atlantic. This was the sign of things to come, but then the world erupted into a global conflict and the transatlantic passenger service, both above and on the water, was rudely halted for 6 years. This was the crucial moment the airplane had needed to get ahead, because while the construction and development of ocean liners had virtually stopped overnight in late 1939, the development of aircraft engines and technology was absolutely paramount. Many things came out of the Second World War that changed the airplane and travel forever. The first was the jet engine. The development of fighter aircraft like the Messerschmitt 262, the Gloucester Meteor and the Lockheed P-80 proved the jet engine as a supremely powerful propulsion system, something that could propel aircraft up to incredible speeds. But arguably the most important development, for passenger comfort especially, was cabin pressurization. In 1940, the Boeing Stratoliner had introduced the system that enabled passengers to breathe and live comfortably at much higher altitudes. The system was perfected in the B-29 bomber. Now the airplane could fly incredibly high up, over the bad weather which had once tormented it. 1952 would prove to be a critical year for the ocean liner. It had benefited from wartime lessons too, and the SS United States was designed and built in the post-war world with technology that had been seen on modern American battleships. Superheated boilers and advanced propeller designs saw the new ship snatch the speed record from the old Queen Mary in July that year and bring the transatlantic crossing down to just 3 days and 10 hours, an incredible feat. This was the fastest an ocean liner had ever been, but it was also the fastest an ocean liner would ever be, because although the United States designers didn't know it yet, even as they were preparing their ship for its triumphant maiden voyage, another vessel's first trip was underway, but this one was above the clouds. Introduced as the world's first commercial jet airliner by Britain's BOAC, the de Havilland Comet shook the world's merchant marines to their core. While its predecessors had been sluggish, cold, and uncomfortable, the Comet promised a new era in air travel with its quiet, pressurised cabin, expanded passenger capacity, and unprecedented fuel efficiency, range, and speed, all thanks to its advanced jet engines. What was once a nightmarish mode of travel now seemed positively cushy by comparison, and that's to say nothing of that speed. Suddenly, a crossing which once took days could now feasibly be undertaken in just hours. Ship owners were initially nervous, but they may have been somewhat heartened by a series of crashes which shook public confidence in the Comet. By the mid-50s, though, the kinks had been ironed out of the Comet and the playing field had been levelled. It was a showdown. Oceanliners against airliners. At first, Cunard and the great shipping lines thought they could weather the storm. Passenger numbers stayed steady in the early and mid-1950s and things looked good. But then, as the decade wore on, something changed. The series of Comet hull losses in the early 1950s, two of them fatal, had forced the company back to the drawing board to address severe issues with the pressurization of its cabins. These overhauls in the design of the aircraft would ultimately result in the Comet 4, in which designers applied all the lessons they had learned from their early efforts to create something that would go on to revolutionise the world of aviation. On October 4th, 1958, the Comet 4 became the first jet airliner to complete a commercial transatlantic flight. Not just one, but two aircraft undertaking the journey simultaneously, one bound for New York and the other for London. The westbound plane touched down after just over 10 hours, including a single brief stop in Gander, Newfoundland to refuel. The eastbound flight completed its journey in just 6 hours. The new jetliners were proving to be to the Oceanliner what the Oceanliner had once been to the sailing ship. Even if it seemed a losing battle, it was still a battle. The great passenger lines tried to stem the falling passenger fares. Cunard especially, with a dozen liners still in service, hoped to sway customers away from this new and speedy mode of transport, with one director quoted as saying, "Flying is a fad, it will pass." Cunard was still operating two of the world's most popular passenger ships, the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth, with 10 other ships accompanying them in the fleet. But they were hard-pressed to convince the public to opt for a 6-day crossing when a 9-hour flight was now entirely within reach. In October 1958, passenger numbers for airlines eclipsed those of shipping lines for the first time, with 1.5 million travellers crossing by air versus a comparatively pitiful 882,000 by sea. It was just a sign of things to come, because that same year, 1958, delivered a death blow to the Oceanliner with the introduction of a real world beater, an aircraft that would bring air travel to the masses. The year prior, it had taken its first flight just south of Seattle, Washington. It was the Boeing 707. This was the aircraft which would define the jet age, with a 600-mile-an-hour service speed, capacity for 181 passengers, compared to the Comet's 70 or so, and an overall safer service record. The Boeing 707 completed its own crossing from New York to Paris on October 26, 1958, and a total of 8 hours and 40 minutes, including the refueling stop in Gander. It would have taken a liner days to cover the same distance. There could be no more denying it. The jet age was well and truly here. This was truly a nightmare scenario for the world's ocean liners and the companies that owned them. Almost overnight, what had once been considered the foremost option for travel was now functionally dead. Nowhere was this more evident than the once glittering New York Chelsea piers. By 1960, the once lively piers were already beginning to fall into disrepair, and where they had at one time been the home to the hustle and bustle of merry travellers and the luxurious liners they sailed on, now the piers were mainly relegated to handling cargo ships. But even this era was short-lived, and the last of the cargo ships had left the piers by 1967. It was a sorry sight. The piers fell into disrepair and abandonment, an ugly stain on the Hudson River front. Airports had taken their place, becoming the epicenter of the bustling travel world. Dramatically impacted by this shift was the United States line, who throughout the 1950s had enjoyed nearly unprecedented success with their record-breaking superliner, the SS United States. The United States was the largest ocean liner ever built by the Americans, and the fastest liner ever too. But even she was no match for the Boeing 707, which was capable of cracking the equivalent of a staggering 521 knots to her 38. It was a fight that the shipping world was sure to lose. While a running mate for the SS United States had been planned, Congress could no longer justify putting millions of dollars behind what was, by all accounts, a dying industry. Funding was withheld and the SS United States successor would never materialise. In 1961, the United States had to cancel a crossing because only 350 passengers had booked. A series of strikes in 1965 saw all of the ship's summer voyages cancelled. She was permanently pulled from service just 4 years later. The SS United States had been a technological triumph, but she only saw service for 17 years, and even then, nearly 8 of those had been a struggle just for survival. While the rest of the shipping world could do little more than balk at the disastrous cards they'd been dealt, the ever-industrious Cunard Line decided to operate under the old adage, if you can't beat them, join them. In fact, a few decades prior to the aviation boom, Cunard experimented with the world of air travel. This was still well before the dawn of the jet airliner back in 1937. Sir Percy Bates, then chairman of the company, was approached by Imperial Airways, who came in with a very tempting pitch. They offered Cunard a partnership and a venture into the world of flying boats, not unlike the Boeing Clipper, to supplement their fleet of liners. Bates had his doubts. Put simply, with the world still relying heavily on sea travel, and the Great Depression putting a damper on much of the travel industry's innovation, he failed to see what the company could stand to gain by expanding from sea to air. But nearly 10 years later, in 1946, Bates' successor, Sir John Brocklebank, seemed to be a more forward-thinking sort, and he was willing to revisit the idea. Brocklebank's plan included an in-house airline to add to the company's fleet, bolstering their position in the ever-changing travel world. In 1960, with airlines now exerting their dominance more and more, Cunard inked a deal with Eagle Airways to purchase a 60% share in their company. This £30 million investment would lead to the introduction of Cunard Eagle Airways, and with the acquisition, the company hoped to cement themselves as a lasting presence in the travel industry despite declining numbers in their ocean-going fleet. It seemed a natural response for the company in the face of dwindling ocean travel, and the very next year, in 1961, Cunard Eagle was operating daily transatlantic flights to accompany its continuing transoceanic schedule. This seemed to do the trick, and eventually Cunard Eagle was operating flights to destinations all around the world. In 1962, the venture caught the attention of BOAC, who in turn offered Cunard a 30% stake in their own company. Cunard Eagle became BOAC Cunard. Eagle Airways pulled out of their side of the agreement a year later, but with tidy profits in 1964, BOAC and Cunard both held on with high hopes for a successful partnership in the long run. The unfortunate truth was that while partner BOAC had both feet firmly in the aviation business, Cunard was still operating a fleet of ships, and a pricey one at that. Meanwhile, aircraft was still evolving, and with the powerful Boeing 747 on the horizon, the company knew they lacked the capital to continue to finance both seagoing and airborne vessels, each becoming pricier with every new iteration. By the late 1960s, despite decades of attempts to position themselves as a travel juggernaut on both sea and air, reality had finally set in, and the overextended Cunard admitted defeat. BOAC Cunard officially dissolved in 1966. This was the last time a passenger shipping company would seriously attempt to toy with the world of commercial aviation. Cunard's chairman at the time, Basil Smallpiece, underlined the company's position by saying Cunard is a shipping company, and it will prosper in the long term by making its shipping operations profitable. It seemed the move was ultimately the right one. The company returned to its roots and reinvested the capital earned by the sale of its stake in BOAC, using the profits to begin the construction of a large, luxurious passenger vessel that would symbolise the next generation of Cunard's fleet, the Queen Elizabeth II. Even with the Oceanliner dying out, QE2, as she would one day be affectionately nicknamed, was designed to maintain a liner's transatlantic service, but she could also run cruises thanks to her clever layout. She was a new ship for a new era. If passenger ship companies were to survive at all, they would have to look to the growing leisure cruise market instead. Other shipping lines found their own ways to try to stay afloat in the face of airborne adversity. Travel on the Atlantic was not the only business impacted by the widespread introduction of jetliners, and in 1960 P&O Line shored up their own defences against the burgeoning air travel threat by merging with their old rivals Orient to create P&O Orient. This move allowed the company to drastically increase its footprint in the Pacific, culminating in a service that spanned 44 countries across a staggering 366 ships. This made P&O Orient the largest ocean-going passenger fleet in the world, and they'd continued to see a surprising amount of success. One factor that helped them defy the odds was the Australian immigration boom starting in 1945. These were the years of the £10 POM scheme, as it was known, the post-war push by the Australian government to urge British citizens to migrate to Australia for the low rate of just £10. Many of these immigrants made their voyages on one of the P&O Orient fleet, my own family among them in 1959, and by the time the initiative wrapped up in 1972, over 1 million people had immigrated to Australia through the program. It served to bolster Australia's population numbers and P&O's traffic, and led the company to make a crucial addition to their fleet. While it may have made sense to play it safe in the face of the bleak outlook, P&O instead decided to up the ante, and in 1961 they introduced their newest liner, the SS Canberra, which upon her completion clocked in at 45,733 gross registered tons, making her the largest liner yet built for any route outside of the transatlantic service. It was clear that P&O intended to keep both feet firmly in the shipping business and fight fire with fire, and for the most part, it paid off for them, even in the face of languishing worldwide passenger numbers. But all of these efforts combined were still a lifeline at best, and even the largest fleet in the world was not immune to the overwhelming shifts brought on by air travel. With the £10 POM scheme at its end and passenger numbers continuing to nosedive, by the mid-70s P&O had scrapped virtually all of its great pre- and post-war liners and moved away to cargo and cruisers instead. Interestingly, while many companies were desperately trying to expand away from shipping to stay alive, some clever business owners were doing just the opposite, and they were finding success. Chandris Lines was founded in 1960, just 2 years after the Comet's first successful commercial transatlantic flight. Much like P&O, the aim of the Chandris line was to capitalise on the still profitable immigration trade to Australia. Their MO was simple: buy retired ocean liners at minimum cost and work them hard for maximum profit. They did this well, and their ships Australis, Ellinis, Britannis, and Patrice became well-known migrant vessels carrying thousands for new lives down under. The 3-week voyage was far from luxurious, and the ships had definitely seen better days. But the business strategy worked, and even as aircraft dominated many major routes, Chandris Line's ships sailed well booked with passengers even into the late 1970s. It was the late 60s that saw the real end of the era of the Oceanliner. Cunard's trusty flagship, the RMS Queen Mary, and her running mate, Queen Elizabeth, still operated on their usual transatlantic run well into the 60s, but as you'd expect, demand was dwindling. Oftentimes, the ships would reach port with fewer passengers aboard than crew. By 1965, the transatlantic service, which once had been the company's bread and butter, was no longer profitable, and the entire fleet was operating at a loss. Both queens were sold off, the Mary to the port of Long Beach, and the Elizabeth to a Hong Kong-based businessman who hoped to convert her into a floating university. The retirement of the queens heralded the real end of an era. The Oceanliner had finally died. But adaptable companies like P&O, Chandris, and even Cunard began to sense a new opportunity to keep some of their fleet in service. Cruising was actually nothing new at the time. In fact, the world's first purpose-built cruise ship had been the Hamburg America Line's Princess and Victoria Louise all the way back in 1900. The 1960s, though, had seen a huge uptick in demand for leisure cruises, even as demand for travel by air was reaching new heights, and cruising offered an experience that airlines couldn't hope to match. A leisurely holiday at sea where one could while away the hours with any number of activities offered on board, all with the freedom to move around the vessel, instead of being restricted to one single seat in the cabin of an aircraft. While airlines offered an efficient mode of travel, cruisers offered an actual enjoyable experience, and it was this very experience that kept the world's ships at sea, even in the face of an industry which threatened to make them obsolete. Many of the remaining great ocean liners found new lives as cruise ships. Probably the most successful was the SS France. She'd been built too late to capitalise on the golden age of the ocean liner. A triumph for her home nation though she was, France was introduced just a few years after the first commercial flight of the de Havilland Comet. She saw only 14 years of service with French Line, and that should have been the end. Except a new and budding cruise line had other plans for her. Norwegian Cruise Line picked France up and transformed her into the SS Norway. What had begun life as a transatlantic passenger liner designed to operate a schedule as ruthlessly and efficiently as a train ended her days as a beloved cruise ship running pleasure voyages around the world. The transition to cruising wasn't easy on all ocean liners, and some just couldn't cut it. The Italian liners Cristoforo Colombo and Leonardo da Vinci were just too expensive to run. They'd been built to absolutely burn through monstrous amounts of fuel to run at breakneck transatlantic speeds, not swanning around on joy cruises. Not only that, but their class-segregated interiors became a confusing maze once the ship was converted to one-class cruising, with staircases that skipped decks and corridors that seemed to go nowhere. By contrast, other ships had been designed with this future in mind. The Dutch SS Rotterdam used a genius system of folding panels that could separate classes during a crossing, or be folded down to open the ship up for one-class cruising. She had a long and successful career with her original owners and beyond into the 21st century. The first half of the 20th century saw the ocean liner at its absolute peak. The world was connected like never before, and passengers could be carried across entire oceans in record times and in unmatched comfort. Countries took pride in producing the biggest and the best vessels the world had ever seen, consistently outclassing one another in terms of size, speed, strength, luxury, and efficiency. But as history has shown us time and time again, technology is constantly finding new ways to change and evolve, so it was little wonder that the ocean liner's days were numbered. Looking back at the success of the SS United States and the blue ribbon holders who came before her, one fundamental truth rings clear. In the eyes of a fickle travelling public, speed comes above everything else. It seems obvious then that for all its wonders, this stately and beautiful mode of travel was bound to be eclipsed by the miracle of flight, and by 1958 that was exactly what had happened. Despite the best efforts of the most illustrious shipping lines of the time, travellers were largely ready to move on from the ocean liner and on to the next big thing. They simply voted with their wallets. The results were disastrous for an entire industry and way of life. The Chelsea piers, once the glorious site of Oceanliner Row, fell into disrepair in the 60s, rotted in the 70s, and then completely collapsed in the 80s before they were fully dismantled. Today, the waterfront has been rejuvenated with parks, bars, and luxury hotels, and only the facade of Cunard's Pier 54 remains of the massive original structure. At the other end of the route, in Southampton, the magnificent custom-built Ocean Terminal building, designed specifically for the big mail ships like Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth, had worked as a kind of lounge and baggage handling facility with a massive train station so passengers could easily step foot from off of their train and onto their ship. It was finished in the 50s, but scrapped in the 80s, already a relic of a bygone era. But within a decade, the cruise industry had exploded and Southampton once again found itself needing exactly the kind of ocean terminal building it had demolished. Today, if you want to board a cruise ship from the port, you won't do so from a beautiful deco building, but from a series of Spartan sheds instead. Such is the march of progress. Of the ocean-going greats that had once won the hearts of millions, few remain today. The Queen Mary has been preserved as a museum and a hotel in Long Beach, California, but Queen Elizabeth caught fire and burnt to a crisp in the 60s before her university overhaul ever bore any fruit. The Rotterdam has been remarkably well restored and now acts as a museum and a hotel in the port of her name in the Netherlands. France served for years as the cruise ship Norway, the sweetheart of tens of thousands of passengers, before being finally scrapped in 2006. United States, the brilliant record-breaking speed demon, has sat rotting for years at a dock in Philadelphia, and now, instead of being preserved for future generations, it looks like she's going to be sunk to become an artificial reef. There is just one glorious ship at sea upholding the old traditions, Cunard's Queen Mary II, a remarkable, special ship built in the early 2000s. She was designed to fulfill the role her forebears had done so well before her. With 40% more steel than your standard cruise ship, at much greater construction expense, the Queen Mary II can take the worst the Atlantic can throw at her. Once, recently, in a terrific storm, most Atlantic traffic was stopped in its tracks, including ships of the Navy, who were bemused to spot, on their radar screens, one vessel making good headway into the huge seas. "What are you?" they radioed out. The reply was simple and concise. "The Queen Mary," they said.